I returned to my family's old bookstore closed for 6 years just to retrieve something I'd left behind. But in the basement, I discovered my son hiding a man whose face had appeared on a wanted broadcast 3 weeks earlier. He slowly pulled a compact black stun device from his jacket. A sharp electric crack snapped through the basement air and he said coldly, "Go upstairs, Dad. I only need 72 hours." I went still. The fugitive's eyes drifted to one of my old novels propped in a shadowed corner, and a slow smile crossed his face. "You're the one who wrote the blueprint that turned me into the perfect criminal. Did you ever find yourself torn between shielding the person you love most and doing the thing you knew was right, yes or no?" A few details here have been shaped for storytelling. What I hope endures is the heart of it, the message beneath the events. The security upgrades I put on that closed bookstore 6 years ago were serious. Motion sensors reinforced locks, everything a cautious man could think of. And yet tonight, with rain beating hard against my windshield, there sat an unplated dark green pickup truck in a spot where no vehicle belonged. My name is Gerald Adler, 64 years old. For 3 decades, I wrote mystery novels that owned the bestseller lists. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you're here for this one. Before we go any further, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Just a small thing, is it morning where you are, afternoon, or late night? There's something about the hour a person chooses to sit with a story like this that tells you a lot about them. Now, a brief note. Some elements of this story have been shaped for the audio format, and any resemblance to specific living individuals is coincidental. What matters is the truth at the center of it. But I never imagined I'd one day become a character inside my own worst nightmare. The storm had come down hard on Hillsboro, Oregon around 10:30. November rain that felt almost biblical, turning every street into a running river. I'd been at home trying to wrap Warren Halsey's birthday present when the thought struck me, the antique Flemish engraving I'd stashed in the Foundry's back office months earlier. A perfect gift for the man who'd been my closest friend since our college days. Sheriff Warren Halsey was turning 65 tomorrow, and I'd made him a promise, something that would actually mean something. 10 minutes, I told myself. In, out, back home before midnight. Driving through that storm felt like the end of the world. My Subaru's wipers couldn't keep pace with the sheets of rain coming down. Lightning split the sky every few seconds, throwing pale light across empty parking lots and shuttered storefronts. The Foundry sat at the edge of a commercial district that time had passed by. Antique dealers, a used record shop, a cafe that seemed to change hands every 18 months. At 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in weather like this, the entire block looked like it had been evacuated. Then my headlights found it. No plates on the truck. That single detail hit me like cold water. It was tucked into the narrow service alley behind the Foundry, pressed against the brick wall where the dumpsters used to stand. Only 2 people in the world knew about that spot, me and my son Beckett. We'd relied on it for years whenever the front lot flooded in heavy rain. But Beckett was living in Portland now, 40 minutes away, with no earthly reason to be here tonight. I'm a crime novelist. I understand what no plates means. I swung into the front lot and cut the engine. Rain drummed against the roof like fists. Through the downpour, the Foundry looked exactly as it had the day I turned that key for the last time 6 years ago. 2 stories of red brick, those narrow windows, the faded gold lettering above the door, the Foundry, rare and vintage books established, 1971. My father's dream, his refuge from a life that had nearly swallowed him whole. Now, just another dark storefront on a fading block. I pulled my flashlight from the glove box and walked into the storm. The rain had soaked through my jacket before I'd taken 3 steps. Cold water traced a path down my neck while I wrestled with my keys at the front door. My hands weren't steady, and it wasn't the cold doing that. The lock gave. I pushed inside. Darkness closed around me completely. 6 years. The bookstore had been locked, monitored, untouched for 6 years. I snapped on the flashlight. The beam drove through the blackness, revealing shelf towers reaching toward a ceiling lost in shadow. Dust motes swirled in the light. Then the smell reached me. Aged paper leather bindings, the lingering ghost of my father's vanilla pipe tobacco. Scents that had no business existing in a building sealed this long. Every shelf, every corner, I knew this place better than my own house. I'd grown up inside these walls, spending afternoons after school reshelving paperbacks while Dad worked the register. I wrote my first novel in the back office, hunched over a manual typewriter hemmed in by first editions and cardboard boxes. When Dad died, I shut the doors. In 2016, I couldn't face selling it or starting over. The foundry became a tomb, a monument, a locked door I visited twice a year to settle the property taxes and check that the security system still had a pulse. Tonight, though, it didn't feel empty. I moved through the main floor, the flashlight swinging left and right. Fiction, history, biography, everything precisely where it had always been. The beam grazed the edge of Dad's old oak desk near the register, still buried under the same papers from the day he died. An invoice from an estate sale, a coffee mug with dried residue at the bottom, a framed photograph of him and my mother on their wedding day, 1956. My father had built this place with his own hands in 1971. He had stocked it with stories capable of saving you or destroying you. Tonight, I was about to learn which. I reached the back hallway. The office door stood to my right. The Flemish engraving would be in the filing cabinet, third drawer, wrapped in acid-free paper. I'd take it and go. Forget the truck. Call Warren from home, maybe let him decide whether it was worth looking into. That's when I heard it. A sound rising from below. From the basement. Low, guttural, barely contained. A groan. I went still. The flashlight shook in my grip. The basement stairwell was 10 feet ahead of me. A black rectangle cut into the wall, dropping into a deeper dark. We'd used that basement for overflow damaged stock boxes of my father's personal effects I'd never managed to go through. I'd been down there once in the past 6 years, maybe 18 months back after a pipe burst, and I'd needed to check for water damage. Nothing lived down there. Nothing could. The groan came again, longer this time. Pain and effort crushed into a sound shaped to stay contained. Somebody working desperately hard not to be heard. That groan I had written, that exact sound 100 times. Someone hurt, concealed, cornered. And they were in my basement. I should have run. Should have backed straight out the front door, gotten into my Subaru, called Warren, and let people who carried badges deal with whatever this was. But 3 decades of writing crime fiction had hardwired something into me, a need for answers, a pull toward danger with a flashlight, and a stubborn conviction that I could handle what I found. The groan reached me a third time, nearer, now more distinct. I stepped toward the basement stairs. Then another step. 6 years that bookstore had been closed. Nobody lived here. Nobody was supposed to be here at all. But that sound, I had put it on the page too many times not to know exactly what it meant. The sound of someone in real pain, fighting every instinct to cry out. My hand found the basement door handle, cold metal against my palm. I pulled it open. Darkness came up from below like rising water. The stairs took my weight with a groan. I'd stopped caring about silence. Each wooden step cried out like a warning I should have heeded. The flashlight bounced ahead of me, picking out concrete walls strewn with water damage and cobwebs hanging thick as curtains. The smell intensified the further I descended, antiseptic, sharp and chemical, and underneath it, copper, blood. The door at the bottom of the stairs was partially open. Light leaked through the gap. Not my flashlight. Electric light. Someone had power running down here. I pushed the door all the way open. The sight stopped me the way a photograph stops, time one I knew I'd spend the rest of my life trying to forget. Beckett Adler, my son, my paralegal son, with his pressed suits and spotless resume, kneeling beside a makeshift cot in the center of the basement. His hands moved with careful, deliberate precision, winding white gauze around the bleeding shoulder of a heavily tattooed man lying shirtless on blood-stained sheets. A battery-powered work light sat on an upturned crate, throwing harsh shadows across both their faces. My son, my only son in my basement with blood on his hands. "Beckett," I said. His head snapped up. For just a moment, one single moment, I watched pure terror move across his face. The same look he'd worn at 7 years old when I caught him lifting quarters from my desk drawer. Then it was gone, replaced by something I had never seen on him before. Something cold. Dad, this wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But the man on the cot was entirely real. 45 years old, heavily muscled, covered in prison ink from his neck to his wrists. A fresh wound in his left shoulder, blood already seeping through the gauze Beckett had just laid down. His breathing was shallow and ragged, and I recognized his face. "I interviewed you," I heard myself say. "Oregon State Cell Block D, November 2012. The man's eyes found me. Recognition passed through them, and then something else. Amusement. "Gerald Adler," he said. His voice was gravel and smoke. "The novelist. Rafe Callum." The name hit my mind like something thrown at speed. I'd spent 6 hours across a prison interview table from this man a decade ago digging into wrongful convictions for a book that never saw print. He'd been serving 12 years for armed robbery. He'd laid out his story with iron conviction framed by corrupt officers sold out by his public defender, innocent of everything except standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. You told me you were innocent. I'd believed him. He was exonerated in 2020. DNA evidence established he hadn't been at the crime scene. The state apologized and cut him a settlement check. The coverage had called it a victory for justice. 3 weeks ago, I'd seen his face in a very different kind of news. An FBI bulletin, a gold heist in Seattle, 3 security guards dead, Rafe Callum wanted for murder. And I wrote you into my book, I said. The Ghost Protocol. Rafe said, already reading my face. His eyes tracked lazily across the basement landing on a dust-covered shelf near the water heater. My breath stopped. There it was, spine out among boxes of my father's old ledgers, a copy of The Ghost Protocol, my 4th novel published 2014, the one in which I had reimagined Rafe's case as fiction. A wrongly convicted man walks free and uses everything prison taught him to become the perfect criminal. Have you ever watched your child do something so incomprehensible that your mind simply refuses to take it in? That's where I stood in the doorway between the father I'd been 60 seconds earlier and the stranger I was about to become. Beckett, I said again. My own voice sounded hollow to me. What is this? He rose slowly, deliberately. Rafe Callum's blood covered his hands, dark and wet beneath the work light. He wiped them on a towel that had once been white. You weren't supposed to be here, he said. This is my building. The words dissolved in my throat. They sounded ridiculous. Legal ownership meant nothing against what was standing in front of me. This man is wanted by the FBI for murder. I know exactly what he is. Then go upstairs, Dad. Not a request. Beckett's right hand moved behind his back, and when it came forward, it held a compact black stun device. His thumb sat over the trigger. Calm. Steady. A sharp electric crack snapped through the basement air. Beckett, put that away. Whatever this is, go upstairs now. The device didn't move. His hand didn't waver. My son. The boy I taught to ride a bike. The teenager who'd sobbed in my arms the night his mother died. The young man who'd finished at the top of his class at Willamette University College of Law, threatening his own father with eyes that held no recognition, no warmth, no hesitation. Behind him, Rafe Callum shifted on the cot. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. Your dad's a hell of a writer, Rafe said. Taught me everything I needed to know. My son stood between me and those stairs, holding that device as though he'd already settled in his mind exactly who I was to him. Move, Beckett said. I stepped backward. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The flashlight slipped from my fingers and clattered across the concrete. Beckett came forward. The device stayed level. I climbed the stairs. At the top, he gestured toward the reading room. Inside, Beckett said. I knew only one thing in that moment. My son had locked me inside my own bookstore, and a wanted man was down there grinning at my book like he'd run into an old friend. The chain rattled as Beckett threaded it through the reading room door handles, heavy industrial links, the kind you'd use to secure a shipping container, not your own father. I stood in the dark with my hands pressed flat against the wood, feeling each metallic clink land like a nail being driven into my chest. This room had been a sanctuary, once a mezzanine space my father built in 1977, floor-to-ceiling shelves and one tall window looking out toward the street. I'd written 3 novels here before the grief of his death made this building impossible to enter. Now it was my cell. The padlock snapped shut. Final. Absolute. You just need to stay quiet for 72 hours, Beckett said through the gap. His voice was measured, clinical. That's all, Beckett. My throat ached. Talk to me. Whatever this is. 72 hours. Rafe will be across the border. After that, you can call whoever you want. Are you doing this for money, Beckett? Silence. Long enough that I believed he'd gone. Then his voice came back quieter but sharp enough to cut. I'm doing this because you and grandfather lied to me for 28 years. The words struck me like something physical. I lurched backward, my hip catching the corner of Dad's old reading desk. 28 years. My son's entire life. What lie? I said. Beckett, what are you talking about? Footsteps descending the stairs. Gone. I pressed my forehead against the door. The wood smelled of old varnish and settled dust. My breath came in short, shallow pulls. What lie? My mind clawed backward, searching for something to hold on to. 28 years ago. 1994. Beckett was born in March. My wife Lorraine was still alive. We were happy. Dad was running the bookstore, teaching Beckett to stack paperbacks before the boy could even read. What on earth could we have lied about? Then another memory broke through uninvited. August, 3 months ago. A bright Sunday morning. I'd been in the kitchen making coffee when Beckett showed up without calling ahead. He'd brought pastries from that bakery on Skulls Ferry Road. My favorite's real butter, too much sugar. He'd smiled, hugged me, played the devoted son without a crack in the performance. How are you feeling, Dad? Good, better. The physical therapist says my shoulder's healing well. Still writing, though, the new manuscript's fighting me. We sat at the kitchen table the way we always had. Coffee, easy talk. He'd asked about my health, my week, whether I'd been in touch with old friends. Ordinary conversation. Comfortable. Then casually, "Are you planning to upgrade the security at the foundry? The cameras, I mean?" I'd laughed. "The shop's been closed for 6 years, son. What's there to steal?" "Just concerned about my dad, that's all. There's been a rash of break-ins around that neighborhood lately. The alarm system still works, that's enough." He nodded, dropped it, changed the subject. Asked about Warren, my publisher, whether I wanted to catch the new Scorsese film. I thought nothing of it at the time. How many times can you miss the truth when it's right in front of you, calling you dad, bringing you coffee, asking questions you believe are driven by love, but are actually driven by something far colder? Because that wasn't the only time. I lowered myself to the floor, back against the door. The reading room had no light except what came in off the street through the window. Orange sodium glow, dim and sickly. July. Beckett had asked about the bookstore's cleaning schedule. "Does Mrs. Chen still come on Tuesdays, June?" He'd mentioned stopping by the foundry to check on things while I was visiting Warren in Portland. "Just want to make sure everything's secure, Dad." May. He'd asked for my old key ring so he could have a copy cut for emergencies. 3 times. He'd asked about the security cameras 3 times across 6 months. Each question framed a little differently: concerned son, watchful, dutiful. I'd handed him a complete map of every security gap without understanding what I was doing. The nausea arrived in waves. I pressed both palms over my eyes until I saw color. He had been planning this for months, possibly longer. Every Sunday visit, every call checking whether I needed anything, every carefully measured question engineered to draw out information. I'd trusted him because that is what fathers do. You don't interrogate your child when they show up with pastries and ask if you're all right. You don't examine their motives when they offer to help. You look at them through the lens of everything you remember. The boy who fell asleep reading under your desk. The one who wanted to grow up to be just like you. Who wept at his mother's funeral and swore he'd always look after you. You miss every single red flag because you're not seeing the man in front of you, you're seeing a ghost. I'd written 23 novels about fathers who couldn't see their son's darkness closing in. I just never imagined I would step into one of my own cautionary tales. The window shuddered in a gust. Rain still beat against the glass, turning the street below into smeared reflections. I could make out my Subaru in the parking lot. Beyond it, empty road, no other cars, no witnesses. Beckett had chosen his night with precision. Storm-late hour sealed building, no cameras, no one to clean or check or interrupt. How long had he been watching and waiting? What other questions had I missed? I got to my feet and crossed to the window, pressing my palm flat against the cold glass. Across the street, a cafe sat dark and locked. Beside it, the record store with its hand-painted sign. An ordinary block on an ordinary night, except my son was sheltering an FBI fugitive in the basement of my father's bookstore, and I couldn't begin to understand why. "You and grandfather lied to me for 28 years. I turned those words over and over like stones, looking for an edge I could grip. What could my father and I have possibly hidden from Beckett his whole life? We'd raised him together after Lorraine died. We'd been honest, open. We'd built a family on trust, hadn't we? The reading room felt smaller suddenly, as though the air was thinning. The shelves pressed in from every direction. Dad's first editions. His maritime histories. His signed Hemingways and Steinbeck's relics of a man I believed I'd known completely. But standing in his locked room, made a prisoner by my own son, something occurred to me that turned my blood cold. I had absolutely no idea what Beckett was talking about, and that terrified me far more than the device in his hand. I had no answers, only questions breeding in the dark, each one worse than the one before. Then, footsteps on the stairs. Beckett was coming back. And when he spoke through the locked door this time, his voice carried the cold, precise delivery of an attorney laying out evidence designed to undo me. "I need you to understand something, Dad. each word measured, calm, professional. This wasn't blackmail. I wasn't coerced. 8 months ago, I approached Rafe Callum with a business proposition. I pressed my ear against the gap in the door. My hands shook against the wood. $800,000. That's what I accepted, Dad. The number hit me like a blow to the chest. I stumbled back, hip catching the corner of the reading desk. $800,000. Beckett's tone never shifted, never cracked. Cash. Half upfront, half on delivery. I provided detailed security blueprints for the Cascade Vault Depository in Seattle. Guard rotations, camera blind spots, vault access protocols, emergency response timelines, everything he needed. I couldn't draw breath. The walls of the reading room seemed to close in. I wasn't forced. I went to him. This was my choice. Why? The word tore out of me. Beckett, why? Silence. Then his voice came back harder. Because I've been living under 40 years of somebody else's debt. My whole life spent in the shadow of a dead grandfather's crumbling legacy and a father's fading fame. I work 70-hour weeks as a paralegal earning $60,000 a year while you sit in your paid-off house writing novels nobody reads anymore. I needed my own future, not grandfather's bookstore, not your old awards. 41. He'd said 41. But Beckett was 28. I knew my son's age. I had been in that hospital room the day he was born. Unless the thought collapsed before it could take shape, my mind refusing to go there. The foundry was perfect, Beckett went on, oblivious to my silence. No active security cameras, 0 foot traffic. The building has been closed for 6 years. Anyone asks, it's empty commercial real estate. And I already knew Rosario's cleaning schedule down to the minute. Second Tuesday of every month, 9 a.m. to noon. Never varies. Rosario Fuentes, our housekeeper. 47 years old, a Guatemalan immigrant who had worked for our family for 15 years. He had turned her schedule into a weapon. $800,000. My son, my only son, standing on the other side of a locked door laying it out like a billing statement. Rafe needed a safe house for 72 hours, Beckett said. I provided one. Tomorrow night he crosses into Canada with forged documentation. I receive the second half of the payment, then it's finished. You never see me again and I never see you. You killed 3 people, I said. My voice sounded far away like it was coming from someone else. Rafe killed 3 security guards in Seattle. I didn't kill anyone. Rafe's operational decisions aren't my responsibility. Operational decisions. He was talking about murder as though it were a line item in a contract. Footsteps. Moving away again, back down the stairs, back to the basement where a wanted killer lay bleeding on a cot. I slid down the door until the floor caught me. Cold wood pressed into my spine. The reading room smelled of old paper and my father's ghost. $800,000. My son had sold his conscience for $800,000. And he was explaining it to me like a quarterly earnings report. I have no idea how long I sat there. Time stopped meaning anything. The storm outside had settled into a steady rain. Somewhere in the walls, pipes groaned. The heating system my father put in during 1984 clicked and rattled. 41 years old Beckett had said, but he was 28. I was 64. My son was 28. The arithmetic was absolute, unchangeable, unless I was losing my grip on reality, unless everything I believed I knew had been wrong. My gaze drifted to the shelves surrounding me. Dad's collection, his life's work first edition, signed copies, Hemingway, Steinbeck, Chandler, and tucked on the third shelf from the bottom spine, barely legible in the dim orange glow bleeding in from the street, my own novels. 7 of them hardcover first editions, including The Ghost Protocol. Rafe's smile. The memory broke over me like ice water, his eyes drifting across the basement, finding that book, the slow knowing curve of his lips. I forced myself to go back. November 2012, Oregon State Penitentiary, Cell Block D. I had been researching wrongful convictions for what would become my most successful novel. The warden had set up interviews with 3 inmates, all serving long sentences, all insisting on their innocence. Rafe Callum had been the 3rd. He sat across from me in that gray interview room for 6 hours, articulate, sharp, convincing. He explained how corrupt officers had framed him for an armed robbery he hadn't committed, how his public defender had been barely present for half the trial, how DNA evidence that could have cleared him had vanished in processing. I'd believed every word. I wrote about him. I understood him. I made him sympathetic. The novel's antagonist, Elliot Crane, had been a direct psychological portrait of Rafe Callum, a wrongfully convicted man who walks free and concludes that the system failed him so completely he owes it nothing, who takes everything 12 years of prison taught him and becomes the criminal he'd been falsely accused of being. The book had been a massive success. 2.1 million copies, sold a literary award, film rights optioned. Rafe was exonerated 8 years later. DNA confirmed his innocence. The state apologized, handed him a settlement check, and 3 weeks ago he killed 3 people in a gold heist. What responsibility does a writer carry when the characters they built step off the page and move through the real world with the blueprint you gave them? I had spent 6 hours with Rafe Callum, cataloging his intelligence, his fury, his tactical mind. I transformed him into fiction, made him a bestseller, put the book on every shelf in America, including the basement of this building. Had I given him the psychological map of a perfect criminal? Had he read the ghost protocol in his cell and seen it not as a warning, but as a set of instructions? The questions spiraled. No answers, just guilt accumulating on guilt. I wrote about him. I understood him. I handed him the exact blueprint to become the man I fictionalized. 10 years of writing, 2.1 million copies, sold a literary award, and all of it in some twisted chain of consequence led straight to this basement, this storm, this night, and a killer looking back at me with eyes full of something that resembled gratitude. The guilt sat in my chest like a stone, but guilt wasn't going to get me out of this locked room. I pushed myself up from the floor and crossed to the window. The rain had finally stopped. The street below was empty and dark, broken only by pools of orange light pooling beneath the lamps. At 12:30 a.m., my neighbor Vera Prudhomme's window light switched on, held for exactly 3 seconds, went dark, then came back again. And in that moment, I understood I might not be as alone as Beckett believed. I pressed my face against the cold glass, breath fogging the pane. Vera lived in the renovated Victorian directly across from the Foundry. 68 years old, retired elementary school teacher, widowed for a decade. She'd brought me a casserole when Lorraine died. She waved from her porch every time I drove past. Warm, unassuming, the kind of neighbor who remembered your birthday and wrote letters to the city about noise ordinances. So why was she awake at midnight? The light blinked again. On 3 seconds off, on again. Too deliberate to be random. I watched for 2 full minutes. The pattern never broke. 3 seconds on, 5 seconds off, repeat. Someone out there knows I'm in trouble. My hands trembled against the window frame. Hope felt dangerous. Hope meant something that could be crushed. But I couldn't stop myself from believing that light was a signal. Then the memory came back. Yesterday morning. No, technically 2 mornings ago now. November 14th. I'd been making coffee when the doorbell rang. Vera had been standing on my front porch holding her signature peach cobbler, the one she baked every Tuesday without fail. Small, barely 5 feet tall, silver hair, cut short, bright green eyes that always looked like they were on the verge of smiling. I know you don't need another cobbler, Gerald, but I made 2 and can't possibly eat them both. You're a saint, Vera. Hardly. Just a bored old woman with too much time and too much butter. We'd talked for maybe 5 minutes, her arthritis, my shoulder, the cold coming in. As she turned to leave, a slip of paper dropped from her cardigan pocket and landed on the doormat. She snatched it up with a quickness that didn't match the arthritis she'd just been describing. Held it up with an apologetic look. My doctor's number. I'm getting so terribly forgetful. I'd glanced at it, handwritten. A phone number with Dr. Morrison printed neatly at the top in block letters. You should save it in your phone, I'd said. Oh, I'm hopeless with those things. Paperwork's just fine for me. She'd smiled and walked back across the street. I thought nothing of it at the time. But standing at this locked window now, the memory sharpened into something different. The number had no area code prefix. The digits were grouped in a way that didn't follow any standard pattern, almost like a tactical field line, and her hands had not trembled at all when she picked it up. They were steady. Too steady. What kind of doctor uses a number formatted like that? Have you ever been so desperate for any sign, any proof that someone out there knows you're in danger that you'd read meaning into a light blinking at midnight? I pressed my face against that cold glass and prayed I wasn't inventing it. The light blinked on. 3 seconds. Off. Vera knew. Somehow she knew. But who was she? And what did she know? Another memory broke through, sharper, more urgent than the last. Friday, November 10th, just last week. I'd been at my desk in the home office when Rosario Fuentes stopped by to return some mail she'd accidentally swept up from my porch the day before. Rosario was our housekeeper, had been for 15 years. 47 years old, Guatemalan immigrant, warm smile that rarely made it all the way to her eyes anymore. She worked 2 jobs to keep her teenage son afloat, cleaning houses through the day, working nights at a hotel near the airport. She'd handed me the small stack of envelopes. I thanked her and started to turn away. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, I was going to come by yesterday afternoon, but I noticed Beckett's car out back around 2 o'clock in the morning, so I didn't want to disturb him. I'd nodded, barely registering it. He probably needed to pick up some old files from the bookstore. Of course. Tell him I said hello. November 3rd. She'd seen Beckett's car at the foundry at 2 a.m. on November 3rd, 11 days ago. Beckett had just admitted he'd brought Rafe into the building about 2 weeks ago. The timeline lined up perfectly. Rosario had seen them. She'd been driving home from her night shift at the hotel. That route took her straight past the foundry. At that hour, the street would have been deserted. She would have clocked Beckett's distinctive Audi sitting in the service alley. She'd seen him, maybe seen Rafe, too wounded, leaning on Beckett as they made their way inside, and she'd said nothing. Not to me, not to anyone. Why? The answer came like cold water to the face. Rosario has a son. She's a single mother working 2 jobs to keep him in this country legally, and Beckett knew exactly which pressure point to press. I could see it clearly now, Beckett approaching her, the calculated smile, the lawyer's measured voice explaining precisely what would happen if she said a word about what she'd witnessed. Immigration investigations. Her son's status called into review. Deportation proceedings. He had terrorized a woman who'd cleaned our home for 15 years, who'd made my wife soup while she was dying, who had trusted us. And I had noticed nothing because I'd been looking at my son through the haze of memory rather than seeing the man he had become. I cast my mind back over the past week. Rosario had come by twice, dropping off mail, collecting laundry. Both times she'd seemed rattled, distracted. Her hands had trembled when she passed me the basket of clothing. I'd put it down to stress, asked if she was holding up. She'd smiled and said she was fine. She had been terrified, and I'd been too blind to see it. Rosario saw them, and my son made certain she would never talk. Across the street, Vera's light kept blinking, its steady pattern in the dark. I stood at that window with my forehead against the glass and arrived at a realization that chilled me deeper than anything else had that night. I wasn't the only person in danger anymore. Rosario knew. Vera suspected something. Beckett had already demonstrated he'd threaten a frightened immigrant mother to protect his plan. What would he do the moment he realized other eyes were watching? The light blinked on. Morning would bring answers, just not the ones I was hoping for. There was nothing I could do to warn anyone. All I could manage was to stand at that window until exhaustion dragged me down to the floor, where I slept in broken stretches against the cold wall. Morning arrived cold and gray, and when Beckett passed coffee through the gap in the locked door, the same blend we'd shared every Sunday for 10 years, I understood that some rituals can't survive what he'd done. The chain rattled. A paper cup came through the narrow gap, followed by a wrapped sandwich. "You need to eat, Dad. Stay hydrated." His voice was measured, clinical, the tone he'd use with a client. I took the coffee. The warmth moved through my fingers. I brought it to my lips and drank. Rich, dark, exactly as I liked it, the same blend we'd always picked up together from that roaster on Alberta Street every month for a decade. We used to sit at my kitchen table every Sunday morning over this exact coffee. He'd walk me through his cases. I'd tell him where my manuscripts were fighting me. The ritual had felt permanent, untouchable. Shows you how wrong a father can be. "Do you even know his real name?" I said through the gap. "Do you know he killed 3 people?" Silence. Then Beckett's voice returned flat and hollow. "I know, and I'm doing it anyway." The coffee turned to something tasteless in my mouth. 3 security guards, people with families with children. I didn't kill them. Rafe's operational decisions aren't my responsibility. Operational decisions. He'd compressed murder into corporate language. You're helping him escape justice. I'm executing a contract. 48 more hours, Dad. Just stay quiet. Footsteps moving away. I sat there holding that paper cup and accepted it. The son I'd raised was gone. Whatever stood on the other side of that door bore nothing inside it that resembled the boy who'd wept at his mother's funeral. 2 hours later, the chain rattled again. The door swung open. Beckett stood in the hallway, relaxed, entirely at ease with himself. 5 minutes, he said. Basement bathroom. Yes, Door stays open. I'm not going to run. I know. You're 64 years old with a bad shoulder. You're a writer, not an action hero. He waved me toward the stairs. I followed him down to the basement. The smell reached me before anything else. Antiseptic. Blood. Sweat. The place looked like a field hospital gauze scattered across the floor, bottles of peroxide and ointment sitting on an upturned crate. The battery-powered work light still burned. Rafe lay on the cot, propped up on pillows, his shoulder freshly wrapped. Color had come back into his face. His eyes followed me as I crossed toward the small bathroom in the corner. "Don't try anything stupid, Dad," Beckett said from the stairs. Rafe's voice drifted over from the cot. "He's right. You know you never were good at the physical stuff." I stepped into the bathroom, barely more than a closet, toilet, and sink. The door had no lock. I could feel both of them watching. I used the toilet ran, the tap washed my hands. The water came out cold. The cracked mirror gave back a reflection that looked 20 years older than it had 2 days ago. When I stepped back out, Rafe was still watching, tattooed arms folded across his chest. "I read your book," he said. I went still. Rafe nodded toward the shelf near the water heater. There it was, spine out among boxes of my father's old ledgers, the dust-covered copy of the Ghost Protocol. "Read it 3 times while I was locked away," Rafe continued. "You wrote me perfectly. The psychology, the patterns of thought, the blind spots a man carries when he's convinced the system destroyed him." My knees gave. I sat down hard on a storage crate. "You handed me the exact map to become the man you fictionalized," Rafe said. "Every chapter, every character choice, you understood me better than I understood myself." "You weren't innocent," I heard myself say, "the way I'd always believed." Rafe's smile was cold and somehow grateful. "I was innocent of that specific crime. Wrong place, wrong time, corrupt officers. DNA proved it eventually." He shifted against the pillow. "But your book taught me precisely how not to get caught the next time." What responsibility does a writer carry when the character he built with care and empathy steps off the page and uses that blueprint to kill 3 people in the world outside? "The protagonist in your novel," Rafe said. "Elliot Crane. You made him sympathetic, intelligent, methodical. You showed how a man who'd been wrongfully convicted could take everything the system put him through and build something the system couldn't touch." "It was fiction," I said barely above a whisper. "It was a roadmap." Chapter 14, Elliot explains how to layer shell companies. Chapter 19, how to move across borders. Chapter 23, how to read the security weaknesses and high-value targets. Rafe's eyes gleamed. "You wrote the perfect criminal. I just had to become him." Beckett stood motionless on the stairs, watching all of this with no expression at all. "The guards in Seattle," I said. "Did Elliot teach you that too?" "Elliot taught me that sometimes casualties are unavoidable if you mean to complete the mission." Chapter 28, the armored car scene. I wanted to vomit, wanted to scream, but I couldn't because sitting there in front of a man I had interviewed with genuine empathy and immortalized with real craft, I understood the terrible thing I'd done. I had spent 10 years studying Rafe Callum, 6 hours in that prison interview room, months building his psychological profile, giving him depth and complexity and humanity. 10 years of research, 2.1 million copies, sold a literary award for profound psychological insight. And sitting in that basement staring at a wanted murderer who was thanking me for teaching him his trade. I understood I hadn't only written about Rafe Callum, I had created him. And now he was lying 10 feet away from me, smiling like I'd handed him the finest gift of his life. Beckett pushed me back upstairs before I could begin to absorb what Rafe had just said. The guilt would have to wait. The knock was heavy, authoritative, unmistakable Warren Halsey's signature 3-rap pattern, the one he'd used for 45 years. And I was gagged, bound, watching through gaps in the floorboards as my closest friend stood 10 feet below me with absolutely no idea I was there. Beckett didn't hesitate. I was halfway up the stairs, heading back toward the reading room, when his hand caught me, cloth rammed into my mouth, wrenched tight at the back of my skull. I struggled, but he had 41 years on me and the focused strength of a man with everything to lose. My arms were wrenched behind me, wrists bound with a zip tie, and he hauled me bodily away from the window, dropping me to the floor beside the mezzanine railing. "Make a single sound," Beckett breathed against my ear. "One noise and I tell him you snapped, that you came at me. He'll take my word over yours, Dad. He always has." Then the knock landed again. 3 heavy raps, a pause, 2 more. Warren, his knock. I'd know that knock in my sleep. 3 and 2 with that exact beat of silence between. 45 years of friendship compressed into a pattern on wood. I wrenched against the zip tie. Beckett's palm sealed over the gag, crushing my jaw shut. Stone-cold eyes. Footsteps downstairs. Beckett angling toward the front door. Through the gaps between the old floorboards, I watched my son's posture shift, shoulders dropping, face opening wide into an expression I had never once seen him wear. Welcoming, warm, a performance so clean it was almost beautiful. The door swung open. "Sheriff Halsey," Beckett said, his voice easy as a Sunday morning. "Good to see you, Beckett." Warren Halsey's voice unmistakable. 65 years old today, his birthday, and county sheriff for going on 2 decades. 45 years, my closest friend. "Is your dad home? I haven't been able to reach him. Tried several times." "He's gone up to Portland," Beckett said. "Visiting somebody from the old days. Forgot his phone on the kitchen counter. You know how he disappears into a project, loses track of everything around him." A pause stretched. Peering through the boards, I could make out Warren's boots. Brown leather polished to a mirror shined the same pair he'd worn to Lorraine's funeral. "Portland," Warren said slowly. "When did he head out?" "Yesterday afternoon. Figures he'll be back tomorrow day after at the latest. Just wanted some solitude to push the new manuscript forward." The lie landed without a tremor, calibrated perfectly, just enough concern wrapped around just enough lightness. Beckett had covered every angle. The distracted writer, the phone left behind, the open-ended return window that nobody could easily pin down. 45 years. Warren had stood beside me at my wedding. He'd helped me lower Lorraine into the ground. There is no one on this earth who knows me better. And yet there he was, 10 meters from where I lay, bleeding, asking my son about my whereabouts, and absorbing every fabricated word. "Mind if I step inside for a moment?" Warren asked. My heart seized. "Of course," Beckett said. The door opened all the way. Warren's boots came across the threshold. Through the floorboard gaps I could piece him together. Navy uniform, duty belt, radio clipped at his hip, clipboard tucked under one arm. 20 years of dangerous doorways had given him a particular way of entering a room, measured, deliberate, taking everything in. His sweep of the interior was methodical, unhurried, and for one precise second, 1 second, his gaze from below snagged on the basement stairwell. Long enough to see it, not long enough to move on it. "The FBI has units working this area," Warren said, pivoting back toward Beckett. "Fugitive tied to a Seattle heist. Extremely dangerous individual. You notice anything off, unfamiliar faces, a vehicle that doesn't belong? You reach me the moment you see it." "Clear." "Absolutely, sir. We'll stay sharp. Anything unusual?" "Strange people. Odd vehicles." "Nothing at all." "Nothing, Sheriff. Quiet as ever." Warren gave a slow nod. His hand came to rest on his belt fingers near the radio. I watched his face from above, the clean jaw, the gray threading his temples, the faint scar cutting above his left eyebrow, the one he'd earned during a bar fight we'd waded into together 30 years back. Warren, I'm up here, right here." I drove my shoulder into the floorboards. The old timber groaned. Warren's chin lifted a fraction, head canting to one side. "The building," Beckett said, not missing a beat. "Old place, it shifts and settles. Dad's been meaning to have someone look at the foundation for years, but you know how tight he holds the purse strings on this building." Warren let out a short laugh. "Stubborn doesn't even cover it. Never did. I know it well." 10 more seconds they stood there, 2 men exchanging easy words, a sheriff doing his rounds, a son giving a plausible account. Everything ordinary. Everything in order. "When your dad surfaces," Warren said, "tell him I need a call. Birthday dinner next week." He's been ducking the conversation, and I'm done letting him. "I'll make sure of it, Sheriff. You have my word." "Good man." Warren turned toward the door. "No, no, 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 no." I raked my fingers across the floorboards. Splinters punched under my nails. Blood slicked my palms. Everything in me was pushing at the gag, trying to force some fragment of sound through cloth and old wood to the man below who had known me half his life. Have you ever been inches from rescue, close enough to hear the voice that could save you, to feel the rush of outside air, when the door cracked open and understood with total certainty that the person would walk away? That is the room I was in. "Take care, Beckett," Warren said. "You too." "Sheriff." The door closed. His footsteps crossed the exterior concrete, measured, unhurried, growing smaller. I quit struggling. Flat on the floor, blood spreading under my hands, tears absorbed into the gag. He had paused on that stairwell for a single second, then looked away. I'll never know whether anything registered behind those eyes. What I know is that his footsteps moving away from that building are the loneliest sound I have ever carried my oldest friend leaving while I lay bleeding into the boards 10 meters over his head. Beckett came up an hour later and snipped the zip tie. No words about what had happened. He pulled the gag free, released my wrists, relocked the door, and was gone. I stood at the reading room window with shaking hands, looking out at the vacant street where Warren's patrol car had been. At 12:15 p.m., my neighbor Vera Prudhomme came out into her garden, lifted her eyes directly to my locked window, and pressed her right hand firmly over her left chest. Held it. 3 seconds exactly. ACI. A field signal I had buried in Chapter 7 of my 4th novel 7 years ago. I flattened my palms against the glass watching her. Her eyes didn't waver, steady, deliberate, giving nothing away. Then she did it again. Right hand over left chest held for 3 seconds, and this time slower. Unhurried, making sure I caught every beat of it. Right hand over left chest, 3 seconds. Exactly the way I'd written it. My breath misted the window. My hands lost all feeling against the glass. Chapter 7, page 143. 3 months of research had gone into that signal. A Cold War relic retired in the 80s. Once technology made it redundant, operatives had used it in open public settings when speech was impossible, a method of confirming identity and passing basic status without uttering a syllable. Precise. Specific. 3 words in a single gesture. I am aware. Vera lowered her hand, turned, and went back inside. No parting wave, no expression. 2 repetitions of the signal, then nothing. She wasn't simply keeping watch, she was communicating an operational posture. My legs buckled. I sank to the floor beneath the window. 2 years of peach cobbler, 2 years of neighborly conversation. Vera Prudhomme had settled in Hillsborough in 2016, the same year The Silent Protocol came out. My 4th novel, the one that laid out Cold War tradecraft and CIA field communications in granular detail. It never cracked the bestseller list, sold moderately and quietly. She had to have read it because nobody executes a field signal that precisely unless they've been trained. And I had never thought to wonder why a woman her age held her hands with such stillness. The piece of paper dropped yesterday morning, the unusual phone number configuration, the steadiness of her fingers retrieving it, the blinking light at midnight. She had been observing this building perhaps longer than Beckett had been architecting any of this. A 68-year-old woman who brings over peach cobbler and carries Cold War CIA tradecraft in her muscle memory learned from a novel I published 7 years ago. Who is Vera Prudhomme retired? Still active, observer, asset. And the question pressing harder than any other, what was she doing in this moment? The signal carried 3 layers in that single gesture. I am aware. I am taking action. Trust me. Trust me. Those were the exact words I'd put in Chapter 7, walking readers through how field operatives deploy this signal with civilians trapped in danger. What it communicates is this: help is moving toward you. Hold steady. Don't do anything that puts you at risk. I'd been sat across from a retired CIA officer who'd operated in Berlin through the 70s, checked every detail until it held. And now the research I'd done to fill out a thriller was being turned back on me as a lifeline from someone who knew exactly what it meant. Somebody trained, somebody capable, already in motion. I put my forehead against the cool wood of the floor and let myself have the thinnest sliver of hope. It curdled 2 hours later. At 2 p.m., Beckett's voice came up through the floorboards, and I pressed my ear against the wood to catch it. The tone was clipped, controlled, the courtroom register he used when he wanted someone to fold. Rosario, I've told you already. You didn't see a thing. A silence. She had to be on the other end of a phone. What you think you saw is irrelevant, Beckett went on. You have no idea what you're talking about. Are we clear? A longer pause. Then his voice descended another register, quieter now and far more dangerous. Your son's legal status in this country exists because I made it possible. Think carefully about whether you want that to change. My hands pressed hard into the floorboards. Rosario Fuentes, 47 years old, single mother, Guatemalan immigrant, 15 years working for this family. Her boy Mateo, 16, born on U.S. soil but living under documentation pressures I had never entirely understood. Beckett had helped them. Pro bono legal work, he'd said immigration paperwork, status, verification. I had been proud of him for it. Then stay quiet, Beckett said. It's that simple. The call ended, footsteps retreating below. I rolled onto my back and studied the water-stained ceiling above me. He is using a mother's most primal fear as a muzzle. Lying there on those floorboards, I thought, this is the child I taught the law to. I had believed he would use it to protect people. Instead, he was turning it into an instrument of terror. Rosario had witnessed something. Most likely she'd seen Beckett bringing Rafe into the building at 2 a.m. on November 3rd, perhaps medical supplies being carried in the unplated dark green pickup truck sitting where it had no business sitting. And Beckett had taken her love for her boy and made it into a leash. Stay silent or watch your family's world collapse. Never stated plainly, never that. Beckett was far too careful for explicit threats, but the meaning couldn't have been clearer. Your son's papers, your son's future, those belong to my discretion now. A woman who cleaned houses for a living, who had carried soup to Lorraine during her final illness, who had never once asked for more than fair pay and basic dignity, and my son had converted her compliance into a hostage arrangement. I thought about the pickup with no plates, the casual framing of 3 deaths as operational decisions, the flat and effectless voice in which he'd said, "I know," when the dead security guards came up. Beckett had violated every principle I'd tried to build into him, and the instrument he was wielding, the law, the very discipline I'd pushed him toward, urged him to master and deploy for good, he was driving it like a blade into a frightened woman's chest. He is holding her child over her head to buy her silence. And if he's capable of doing that to Rosario, where does it end? Flat on those cold boards, I understood that I no longer knew my son. The more unsettling question, had I ever? Or perhaps I had spent a lifetime writing the inner lives of people while completely failing to see the ones standing beside me. For 52 years I had walked past that landscape, painting my father's Oregon wilderness in watercolors, the mountains he loved. Never once did I take it down to look at what lay behind it, because the knowing felt too dangerous. It faced me now from the opposite wall, faded decades of light through the reading room window having leached the color from it. My father had painted it in 1970, in the early days of the foundry, when he still had faith in clean beginnings and honest labor. I was 12 the first time he showed me what it concealed. A Sunday afternoon, just the 2 of us in this room. He'd lifted the canvas from its hooks and uncovered the antique wall safe set into the studs behind it. Black iron combination lock, the kind you'd expect in a railroad office from the 1920s. "Something in there I am not proud of," he had said, his voice low, carrying a heaviness I didn't have words for at 12. "But I leave it so that one day you will need to know the truth." He'd rehung the painting and never raised the subject again. He died when I was 25, 40 years ago. I took over the foundry and kept it going for another 33 years. Then shut it down in 2016 when the weight of maintaining it grew heavier than I could bear. 52 years in this building, with this room, with this painting, with that wall. And I never asked because I was frightened of what the answer would cost me. 23 novels I wrote about people who dug after the truth characters, who pursued hard facts, paid dearly for what they uncovered, and stood by their knowledge anyway. And for 52 years I had chosen not to know, because the comfortable story was easier to inhabit than the wreckage of a true one. The irony had always been there. I'd just looked away from it too. At 5 p.m. the lock turned. Beckett came through the door, actually stepped into the room for the first time since sealing me inside it. No weapon this time. No escalation. He pulled the door shut behind him and settled into the wooden chair across from me. Just 2 men in a small room. "Do you want to know why I'm doing this, Dad?" His tone was unhurried, almost level the voice of a man discussing something over Sunday coffee rather than the architecture of a crime. I nodded. My throat had gone too dry for words. Beckett leaned back and crossed his arms. Whatever anger had driven him before was gone from his face. So was the calculation, the desperation. What remained looked like a lawyer laying out evidence, one who already knew the verdict. "Not for money," he said. "Not entirely." He let that sit a moment. "I discovered something. About this family. About grandfather. About you." My hands pressed hard against my knees. 14 months ago, Beckett went on. I was working through old archival legal records at the firm. Routine audit. Boxes of files from the 80s that hadn't been touched in decades. He uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. Something didn't add up. Financial transactions running through the foundry's business accounts. Patterns that made no sense against inventory or actual sales figures. So he had dug further. The air went out of the room. Grandfather laundered money for a crime syndicate. 8 years, 1980 to 89. The words hit like something physical. Gambling debts, Beckett said. Compounding. The syndicate gave him a way out, route dirty money through the bookstore, and they'd wipe the slate. So he did it. 52 years dissolved around a sentence. Something I am not proud of. Millions passed through those accounts, Beckett continued. Layered, sanitized, documented to look like rare book transactions, legitimate on every surface. He ran it for 8 years, right up until he died. Then the flow simply stopped. Beckett's eyes held mine. "Did you know, Dad?" He didn't move while he asked it. "Or did you choose not to know the way? You choose not to know everything that matters?" I said nothing. 10 seconds, 20, 30. What is it we actually hand down the stories we polish about who we were, or the secrets we lock behind a painting and trust our children to ignore? Your silence tells me everything, Beckett said quietly. And he was right. Not the particulars, not the amounts, the timeline, the syndicate's name. But I had known something was crooked. My father's peculiar hours through the 80s. The way his body would stiffen when a patrol car came past. The basement office he kept locked against me. The sudden infusion of cash in 1982 that pulled the bookstore back from foreclosure. I was 17. I had eyes. I had enough sense to form the question. I chose not to ask it. When he died in 1994, heart attack at his desk, sudden and absolute, the bookstore came to me along with everything underneath it. The tidy ledgers, the accounts that didn't reconcile, the paper trail that pointed toward doors I had no wish to open. So I boxed it all up. Literally, carried those ledgers down to the basement and put them out of reach. I chose the version I could live with. My father was an honest man who loved books and literature and died before his time. Disregard the safe, disregard the locked office, disregard the money. But I grew up hearing you tell me about grandfather's integrity. Beckett said his honesty, his moral backbone, the way he stood against corruption when it would have been easier to look away. His voice caught just slightly at the edge. You made him into something. A figure. The man who testified against criminals. The one who gave up everything for the truth. I looked at the painting, the mountains, the wilderness, my father's brushwork, still careful after all these decades. He wasn't that man, Beckett continued. He was a criminal, and you knew it. You've always known. I was 12, I said, the words finally coming loose. He showed me the safe when I was 12. And you never opened it. No. Why didn't you? Because I was terrified of what was inside, because not knowing felt survivable. Because the lie I could hold in both hands was easier to carry than the truth that would have crushed them. Because I didn't want to know. Beckett nodded slowly, the nod of someone receiving a confirmation they'd long expected. So you understand, he said, why I did what I did. Why I went to Rafe, why I took the money. I didn't understand, not remotely. Our family name, Beckett said. Everything it stands on, it's built on crime and concealment. Grandfather moved millions through dirty channels. You took over his operation and looked the other way. And then you raised me on lessons about integrity, about moral courage, about truth. Lessons you knew were built on fiction. He moved for the door. I'm just carrying the tradition forward, Dad. Just being honest about what it actually is. He paused at the door hand on the knob, and I thought that was his exit, that crushing equation left to settle over me. Then he turned back. Rafe Callum knows everything about what grandfather ran through those accounts. Senior figures from that same syndicate told him in prison. That's why he chose the Foundry. He knew I couldn't go to law enforcement without pulling my father's history into the open. He holds the leverage here, Dad, not me. The words came down like ash settling after a fire. Rafe hadn't landed on this building by accident. He hadn't wandered into Beckett's scheme through coincidence. He'd selected it with precision because he knew my father's past, knew I'd spent decades guarding that legacy, and knew that calling in the police would mean lighting all of it, the laundering, the syndicate, the carefully tended myth of my father's good name on fire myself. I wasn't trapped by my son's scheme. I was trapped by my own family's buried crimes. And you genuinely believe you're smarter than a man like him, I asked. Something crossed Beckett's face, a flicker, barely a second. Something that might have been doubt. Then the hard surface came back. I used to, he said. The door closed. The lock clicked. His footsteps descended the stairs and faded. I sat in the thickening dark and turned over everything I'd just been told. Rafe hadn't simply read my novel. He'd done a full excavation of my family, our secrets, our pressure points, and laid an offer in front of Beckett that a man carrying that much anger and that much ambition couldn't walk away from. The trap inside, the trap inside the trap. At 7 p.m., sitting alone in that locked room, my hand found my corduroy jacket pocket out of pure reflex. The familiar rectangular shape, my vintage cassette recorder. I'd had it on my person every day for 20 years, a holdover from my early research period when I'd record sources and let them talk. Every other writer had migrated to smartphones, cloud backup, digital platforms. I'd stayed with tape. Beckett had needled me about it for years. You're a fossil, Dad, just get an iPhone. But my son had missed something. He spent a year calling me a dinosaur for it. Get with the century, Dad. But writing 23 crime novels teaches you to pay attention to what actually survives. Tape can't be hacked remotely. There's no server that can wipe it. It holds up physically in front of a judge. I pulled the recorder from my pocket and checked the small indicator light in the dim room. Still going. I'd switched it on that morning out of nothing more than long-standing habit, the same reflex that had guided me for 2 decades. Always capturing, always on, just in case. Beckett had talked for hours, sprawling monologues about the money, the operation, Rafe's background, my father's crimes, the threat he'd leveled at Rosario, the timeline for the Canada crossing. Every syllable of it had gone onto magnetic tape, every confession, every figure, every name he'd let slip. I checked the counter. 40 minutes left on a 90-minute tape. More than enough. Tape can't be hacked, can't be wiped from across a network, can't be traced by location. And when a federal court wants something it can hold in its hands, magnetic tape is not something any lawyer talks away. Beckett, you ridiculed that recorder a dozen times. But you never once stopped to ask why I kept choosing tape over an iPhone. I slipped it back into my pocket and felt something change. Not hope, not yet. Something more like the first outline of a plan. Night came down. The reading room went dark except for the amber wash of streetlights bleeding through the window. I sat on the floor and went through what I knew. Beckett had taken payment for security blueprints. Rafe had chosen this building deliberately because of what my father had done here. Vera Prudhomme was running some kind of external operation. The cassette was capturing everything. And roughly 48 hours remained before Rafe's border crossing. 48 hours. Whatever I was going to do had to happen before that window closed. I got up and crossed to the landscape painting. My father's brushwork, the Oregon wilderness, the mountains he'd spent his life returning to. I lifted it away from the wall. The safe was still there, set into the drywall black iron combination lock, unchanged since I was 12 years old. No key. These old residential models run on a 4-digit combination. My father was a creature of fixed, inflexible habit. I tried his birth year, 1923, nothing. I tried the year the foundry opened, 1971, nothing. Then I tried the year I was born, 1958. The lock gave. The door swung open. What does a man leave behind when he knows his legacy is poisoned? A warning, a confession, or a sealed emergency beacon. He prays his child never needs to use. My hands went in trembling. A thick, leather-bound dossier, dense and heavy. A yellowed manila envelope sealed with red wax. And beneath those, a device. Not just the dossier, which was almost certainly a record of everything he'd done. Not just the envelope, which might be a confession, an explanation, an apology, but an actual emergency beacon charged and ready, waiting 52 years for the moment it would be needed. My father had prepared for this exact day. The question was, what had he been preparing for? I set the beacon aside and drew out the dossier. Even by the thin light from the street, I could read the careful handwriting on the cover. Transaction records 1980 to 1988. Below that, in smaller script for Gerald, when the day comes that you cannot look away any longer. The safe had opened, and what lay inside had been waiting 52 years. I held the dossier in my hands, solid, dense, undeniable, and understood. My father hadn't simply concealed evidence of what he'd done. He'd constructed a complete record, names, dates, amounts, routing details, everything required to dismantle the people who'd driven him into it. The envelope was still sealed. The emergency beacon sat cold and ready. I had 48 hours to figure out what to do with all of it. I spread everything on the floor in front of me, the beacon, the envelope, the dossier arranged like exhibits at a trial. By the narrow beam of my pocket flashlight, my father's precise handwriting filled page after page names. I recognized dates spanning 8 years, dollar amounts that came to a total of $4.7 million in laundered money. $4.7 million cycled through a quiet suburban bookstore in Oregon across an entire decade. The first entry was dated January 1980, the last December 1988. 8 years of methodical documented crime. Each transaction recorded with the care of an accountant, routing sequences, account numbers, dates, amounts. My father had kept a perfect ledger of his own wrongdoing. The names hit me one by one like faces surfacing from deep water. Thomas Garrett, real estate developer. His daughter had been in my high school class. Richard Callaway, city councilman. He'd spoken at my graduation. Mateo Whitmore, federal judge. He'd officiated at my wife's cousin's wedding. Prominent families, political reach, legitimate enterprises that needed dirty money scrubbed clean, and they'd run it all through my father's shelves. I traced my finger down one page. A single transaction from March 1982, $127,000 routed as an estate book sale layered through 3 shell accounts emerging clean inside a Portland investment fund. Another entry, June 1984. $89,000 dressed up as rare manuscript purchases from European dealers who had never existed. page after page, year after year. Had I ever actually known my father, or had I spent my life in love with the character he'd constructed? I closed the dossier and pressed both palms over my eyes. The memories came back, and they looked different now. The suffocating anxiety that gripped my father through the late 80s, the way his hands shook when certain calls came in, the low, pleading, desperate voice I'd hear through my bedroom wall at midnight, the well-dressed men who drifted through the foundry without once glancing at a spine. I could picture them now. Expensive suits, gold watches. They'd come through the door, exchange 3 sentences with my father, and walk back out. I'd thought as a boy that they were rude customers. They weren't customers at all. They were checking on their asset, confirming my father remained compliant, verifying the flow hadn't been interrupted. And there was something else I remembered. In 1986, a legitimate developer put $2 million on the table for the foundry property. Prime location, right zoning, obvious redevelopment potential. My father turned it down flat. I'd asked him why we could have been free of it, retired somewhere easier, left behind the 70-hour weeks propping up a struggling shop. He'd looked at me with eyes that carried everything he couldn't say, and told me, "Some things can't be sold, son. This place is complicated." I'd taken that for sentiment. I thought he refused because he loved the building. He didn't own it to sell. He was holding it in trust for them. The property wasn't his, it was infrastructure for a criminal network, and my father was its caretaker, not its owner. A custodian, a glorified employee. I opened the dossier again and turned to the final pages. The transactions ended in December 1988 without comment, no final note, no closing entry, just an abrupt silence. My father died 6 years after that, 1994. Heart attack, sudden and complete. I was 36, still turning out novels, still carrying the story of who he was. The estate moved through probate without incident except for one thing. The executor, a lawyer I'd never encountered before and never saw again, told me there was inherited business debt that had to be settled before the estate could close. $300,000 payable to an anonymous escrow account. No name, no explanation given. I was told it was not negotiable pay or probate stays frozen. So I paid. Emptied my savings, took on loans, satisfied the figure, and moved forward. $300,000. I thought it was inherited debt. It was a ransom. My father had purchased our exit. Can a man ever truly be free of his father's sins? Or do those sins simply go quiet for a generation, biding their time, waiting to climb back out through his children? I understood now. My father had run that operation for 8 years, 1980 to 1988, because he had never had a choice. Before I tell you what came next and what it would cost me to finally understand what my own family had really been, let me ask you this. If someone you loved had kept a devastating secret from you for decades, would you want to know the truth, or would you rather it stayed buried? Gambling debts, syndicate pressure, the classic snare. But in 1988, he'd found a way out, negotiated his exit somehow, and kept those meticulous records as insurance, as leverage, as proof he could burn the whole structure down if they came after him. When he died in 1994, the syndicate extracted one final payment, $300,000, to sever the Adler family from their network for good. My father had orchestrated it from the grave. He'd shielded me, bought my freedom, ensured I could walk away untouched, and I had paid that ransom without ever grasping what it actually was. 28 years later, I was locked in a room above that same bookstore, and the son of the man who'd given everything to purchase my clean exit was now voluntarily selling himself back into the same darkness. 35 years later, that old debt is demanding payment through my son. History doesn't just repeat itself. It collects interest. I picked up the yellowed envelope, still sealed, my name written on it in my father's careful hand. To Gerald. Inside would be his account of things, his confession, his apology perhaps, instructions for what to do with the dossier, maybe a warning I wasn't ready to receive. I set it back down unopened. Not yet. I needed to think, to take the full measure of what I was holding before I let his voice reach me from wherever he was. The emergency beacon rested beside me, cold and silent and patient. My father had left me 3 things: evidence capable of destroying powerful people, a letter I was afraid to open, and a device I hoped would never be necessary. He had bought our freedom at a price he chose never to mention, and now 3.5 decades on that buried debt was extracting itself through his own grandson. I looked at the cassette recorder in my jacket pocket, still running, still capturing, and recognized 2 tools my father had handed me without knowing it: the obsolete technology Beckett had always ridiculed, and the documented truth he'd spent 8 years assembling. both sitting ready for the exact moment I would need them. I stayed there with those weapons until exhaustion dragged me down, slumped against the wall, the dossier still open across my lap, the emergency beacon cold against my thigh. Gray dawn pressed through the window. My second morning as a prisoner. At 6 a.m., Vera Prudhomme stepped into her mist-covered garden, turned her face directly to my window and raised 3 fingers, pulled them to a fist, then extended them again. 3 deliberate repetitions, then a point toward the eastern intersection where I suddenly understood her tactical team was positioned. I stood at the glass and watched her work through the sequence with total precision. 3 fingers, 3 repetitions, then the eastern corner. This was more than a signal. She was transmitting specific tactical information. I followed the line of her gesture toward the intersection. The old public telephone booth stood on that corner, rusted, graffiti-covered, slated for demolition for 5 years and somehow never touched. That phone booth, the number she'd slipped under my door, her team was there. The strangely formatted number with no area code, not a doctor's office. A tactical field line. Her people were staged at those exact coordinates using the booth as their anchor point. I am not alone. I have not been alone for a single moment. Vera turned and went back inside. No wave, no expression. Just that sequence executed 3 times to make sure I'd absorbed it, and a clear fix on her team's location. I stepped away from the window legs, unsteady beneath me. A 68-year-old neighbor running a counter-hostage operation from her garden. She had known before Warren did, possibly before I did. How long had Vera Prudhomme been watching this building? I went back through every exchange with her over the past 2 years. The peach cobbler delivered on the 2nd Tuesday of every month, precisely when Rosario came to clean the bookstore. The offhand questions about whether I had any travel planned. The way she arranged her garden chairs to hold a direct sight line to the foundry's entrance. She had been monitoring this sector, not casually, professionally. I am not alone. I have not been alone for a single second of the past 36 hours. The 68-year-old neighbor who shows up with peach cobbler. The woman who had this perimeter under surveillance before I even recognized the threat. She is running an active counterintelligence operation, and I still don't know her real name, but she knew mine, knew my novels, knew the CIA field signals I'd spent months researching and then published. She had used my own work to prove to me she was operational. The question wasn't whether she had the means to help. The question was what she was waiting for. At 9 a.m., the lock turned. Beckett opened the door. "Basement," he said. "You need your heart medication." I didn't have heart medication. We both knew that. This was reconnaissance. Beckett wanted me to see Rafe stable, recovering, nearly ready to move. I followed him down the narrow stairs. The basement smelled cleaner today. Less antiseptic, less blood. Rafe had evidently been mobile enough to clear away the medical debris. He sat on the cot, propped against pillows, working through an old paperback I recognized from the fiction section upstairs. John le Carré, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. He looked up as I came in. His eyes were sharper than before. Alert, reading the room. "Do you know what people in my circle call your son?" Rafe asked. I shook my head. "Junior." The word fell flat, simple, dense, with weight. Beckett stood on the stairs, silent, watching without expression. Junior Rafe repeated the precise terminology used exclusively by the old syndicate to designate the direct descendants of original members. He set the paperback aside. "Your boy wasn't the first Adler to bridge that gap and come looking for my associates." My chest tightened. His grandfather ran operations for the very same people I served. Different era, same blood. Rafe said it without cruelty, just as a fact. When your son found us 18 months ago, he didn't need to explain the family history. The old-timers already knew. They remembered your father, remembered the foundry, remembered the accounts that moved through here in the 80s. 18 months. Beckett had been constructing this for a year and a half. He came to us, Rafe continued, not the other way around. Walked into a bar in Portland that only certain people know to walk into. Asked to be introduced to someone who could use his legal expertise, someone who understood legacy operations. Beckett shifted on the stairs. His face gave me nothing. The first thing the old man asked him, Rafe said, was, "Are you Adler's boy?" And when your son said yes, the old man laughed and said, "Junior's come home." Can you ever truly cut your bloodline free from its sins, or does each generation simply reinterpret the same corruption in new language, convinced they're different until the cycle closes around them? Your father bought your freedom, Rafe said quietly. Paid the ransom, severed the tie, made certain you'd never have to touch any of this. He nodded toward Beckett. And 35 years later, your son walked back in of his own free will. Called it reclaiming his birthright, called it taking what was owed to him. Rafe's eyes held something that could have been pity. The syndicate has a saying, the sons always come back. They just don't know they're doing it. Beckett's voice came from the stairs, cold and tight. I made my own choice. Sure you did, Rafe said. Same as I made mine, same as your grandfather made his. We all tell ourselves we're choosing, but the network knows its own blood when it walks through the door. I stood in that basement looking at my son on the stairs and the fugitive on the cot and understood. Junior. My son had voluntarily stepped into the exact underworld his grandfather had spent his life trying to escape. A perfect circle closing after 40 years. And I was standing between two generations of the same sin, asking myself, what is the true legacy of the Adler name? Time's up, Beckett said. I climbed back up the stairs with my son's footsteps behind me and returned to my locked room carrying that word in my skull like a stone. Junior, not Beckett, not son, not lawyer. Junior, the title his grandfather had worn in secret, the legacy my father had died trying to bury, and the identity Beckett had claimed as a point of pride. Back in the locked reading room, that word kept tolling somewhere behind my eyes. Junior, the legacy reborn. How much corruption can compress itself into the gap between floorboards? At 11:30 a.m., I lay flat on the reading room floor, ear pressed to the narrow crack between the old oak boards, and began to find out. The cassette recorder was beside me, spools turning without a sound. I'd started it the moment I caught Beckett's footsteps below, pacing in tight circuits, his voice climbing and falling in a phone call I couldn't quite parse until I caught the number. 3.2 million. My blood went cold. I pressed my ear harder into the gap. Splinters dug into my cheek. I didn't move. Beckett's voice sharpened, taking on the clean professional register he used when he was in control, layered across shell accounts over 14 months. Corbin and Aldrich finalized the transit documentation Tuesday. Everything is in place. 14 months. Corbin and Aldrich, my son's law firm, my son's colleagues, I had met them both. Corbin Vreeland, sharply dressed, Willamette University College of Law white-collar defense. Aldrich Oster, older, measured 20 years at the firm in corporate litigation. Both of them corrupt. Both co-conspirators in a scheme that had been running for over a year while I sat in my house writing novels about fictional criminals. Beckett's voice dropped lower. Rafe moves this Thursday regardless of weather. November 21st. But that plan had just shifted. The Canadian contact confirmed the route through Blaine. 3:45 a.m. No variance. Thursday, November 21st. 5 days from now. Rafe Callum wanted for triple murder. Lying in my basement with a healing wound, and he would cross into Canada in 5 days unless I stopped it. I thought about my father, not the man who'd moved dirty money through a bookstore in the 80s. Further back than that. 1966 Cleveland. He was 32 years old, working as an accountant for a manufacturing company. He discovered the books had been cooked union funds, siphoned workers' pensions stolen by men in expensive suits who considered themselves beyond reach. He'd testified before a federal grand jury and put 3 of them in prison. 6 months later, someone ran his car off the road. He survived with a broken back and permanent nerve damage. The message needed no translation. Testify again and the outcome will be different. He moved to Oregon, opened the foundry, tried to begin clean, and 20 years later, the same breed of men had tracked him down anyway, boxed him in, and turned him into exactly the thing he'd once stood against. Dad died fighting men like this, and I raised one. Beckett's footsteps crossed the floor below. I tracked the sound with my ear, following him from the front room toward the basement stairs. His voice dropped slightly but stayed within reach. The total a pause, then 3.2 million across 4 clients. Rafe is the proof of concept. The others move in January and March. 3.2 million. I worked the arithmetic in my head. Beckett had told me 800,000 for Rafe. If the total was 3.2 million and the rate held across clients, that meant 4 fugitives at minimum. Rafe was not a singular transaction. He was the beta test. My son was not some misguided man shielding one desperate individual. He was an architect, a systems builder constructing a corporate-grade fugitive transit network that would move high-value criminals across international borders for just under $1 million per head. The reading room floor felt like my father's grave. I lay there, cassette still turning, and grasped the full shape of what Beckett had built. Not a crime, an enterprise. Infrastructure personnel, quarterly targets, Corbin handling the documentation, Aldrich managing the financial layers, Beckett coordinating logistics. A law firm that had become a criminal cartel. And I had raised the man who drew the blueprints. Beckett's voice faded out entirely. Silence below. I held still, barely drawing breath, listening for any sound at all. Then I heard it, the creak of the basement stairs. He was coming up. I grabbed the cassette recorder, hands not cooperating, rolled sideways behind the bookshelf just as footsteps sounded in the hallway outside the reading room door. The lock turned. I held my breath. The door came open. Beckett's shadow moved across the threshold. I could see it through the gap between the bookshelf and the wall, a thin strip of darkness drifting across the floor. He stood there without speaking, his gaze moving around the room. I pressed my back flat against the wall behind the shelf the cassette recorder held against my chest. 3 more steps and he would see me. 3 steps. That was all the margin I had. I heard him breathe, heard the fabric of his jacket shift as he redistributed his weight. Then his phone buzzed. He picked up immediately. His voice came down careful. "I can't talk long. Dad's upstairs. I'll call you back from the car." The door closed. The lock clicked. Footsteps retreated down the hallway. I stayed pinned behind the bookshelf for a full minute listening to my own pulse drum through my ears. Dad's upstairs. He knew I was here. Knew I was sealed inside this room. Knew I was powerless. What he didn't know was the cassette recorder. He had no idea I'd been lying on those floorboards with my ear in the gap capturing every word of his phone call. 3.2 million. 14 months. 4 fugitives. Corbin and Aldrich. Thursday departure at 3:45 a.m. through Blaine, Washington. Every detail, every name, every figure preserved on magnetic tape in unhackable analog form. I pulled myself up from behind the bookshelf and settled on the floor back against the wall, recorder in my lap. The spools had gone still. The tape was full. 90 minutes of evidence. Beckett's confessions, his phone calls, his coordinates, his timeline. Everything a federal prosecutor would need to pull a criminal conspiracy apart at the seams. Everything except a way out of this locked room. I looked at the window. Vera's house across the street. Her tactical team staged at the eastern intersection. 5 days until Rafe crossed the border. 5 days to figure out how to deploy this evidence. 5 days to settle whether I was willing to destroy my son to stop what he had become. I stood at the reading room window and watched Beckett's silhouette move through the garden below. The cassette in my pocket held his admission enough to end him. The weight of it pressed against my ribs like a second heartbeat, keeping its own time. Your son, your son, your son. But the novelist in me recognized something that mattered. This wasn't the climax. It was barely the second act. I went back to the desk and spread out what I had: the cassette, my father's ledger, the photographs from Beckett's study, the timeline I'd assembled. 40 years of watching courtroom strategy compressed into a single tactical picture. If Beckett had moved one fugitive across a border, he'd built a system to do it. Systems have patterns. Patterns have weak points. My hands moved across the paper, drawing lines between facts the way I'd once used to dismantle alibis on the page. Rafe's arrival on October 12th. The basement renovations Beckett had commissioned in September, soundproofing for your writing retreat, he'd called it. The new lock on the wine cellar. His sudden focus on Canadian property law the previous spring. His pattern of absences, always mid-month, always 3 days. The shape of it emerged the way a photograph rises in Developer. This had been in motion for months. An admission of harboring Rafe wasn't enough. I needed the full architecture, names, dates, money trails, every person in the chain. Beckett had handed me a confession. Now I needed him to hand me the entire operation without knowing what he was giving away. I checked the clock. 2:47 p.m. In my pocket sat my father's micro-cassette recorder, the one he'd used for dictating notes. Beckett had watched me use it 1,000 times. It would read as natural in my hands, unthreatening, just a novelist collecting his thoughts. I pressed record and set it on the desk, tucked partly behind a stack of manuscript pages. Then I called down to him. Beckett came in cautiously, his gaze moving over the room, the papers, the photographs, the ledger open to a page dated 1983. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my voice pitched to sound beaten rather than purposeful. "I need to understand why." He took the leather chair across from me, the same chair my father had used during our own hard conversations. I watched him choose his approach. He'd go for empathy, I was sure of it. He'd try to make me see Rafe as human, make me a participant in his moral arithmetic. "Dad, what would you have done?" His tone carried the measured reasonableness he used with clients when explaining decisions they wouldn't like. Rafe came to me in September of 2021, not last month, more than a year ago. He was desperate. The charges against him had been manufactured by a corporate machine protecting its profits. He had documentation of environmental contamination they'd buried for decades. I'd heard this story, or close enough to it, in 100 variations. I let my silence pull more from him. Corbin put us in touch. Beckett continued, leaning forward. He handles the mechanics, transportation documentation, crossing schedules. Aldrich manages the money side, payments, transfers, keeping it all clean. My role is straightforward. I provide a place to disappear for a few weeks before the final crossing. The foundry is ideal for it. My pulse hammered, but I kept my face still. The crossing, Blaine, Washington. There's a window at 3 a.m. when the staffing thins out. Rafe goes tomorrow night. Tonight, technically. November 17th at 3 a.m. He glanced at his watch. In roughly 12 hours, he'll be in Vancouver, and this will be finished. How many? I asked quietly. Beckett paused. This was the pivot point he could pull back into vagueness or step all the way into the confession. I watched him measure which truth would cost him less. Rafe is the 8th this year, he finally said. We started small, one person last February, another in April, but the demand turned out to be far greater than we'd calculated. By next February, we expect to be moving 8 to 10 people every month. It's become efficient, 8 to 10 per month. Those words settled between us like smoke that wasn't going anywhere. One FBI fugitive in my basement, that wasn't the story. Not even close. And it wasn't simply my son committing one terrible moral failure. What I was looking at was a production line, a full-scale underground railroad running on a schedule with my family's name serving as its shield. I stared at Beckett, the boy whose shoelaces I'd tied, whose skinned knees I'd cleaned, whose first courtroom brief I'd stayed up marking and read, and saw a stranger. Someone who had quietly assembled an entire criminal operation while his father sat 2 floors up inventing fictional wrongdoing. Dad, his voice cut through. Cut. Say something. But nothing came. The recorder was still running, catching every syllable. I was holding the full map of what he'd built. Names, dates, the border crossing, the whole scope of it. Every instrument needed to bring him down sat in my hands, and I had exactly 12 hours to choose whether to use any of it. The chain lock clicks open at 11:02 p.m. I know because I described it in Chapter 9 of Shadows on Marble. The drafting pencil technique, the 3-point pressure system, the final quarter turn that releases the tumbler without sound. Fiction becomes instruction manual. Beckett had shut me in the reading room at 5:17 p.m., minutes after his confession. 6 hours ago. 6 hours in the dark with a cassette recorder and a decision I couldn't reach. Hand my son to the authorities or keep quiet while fugitives moved in a steady line through my hallways. Then around 10:30, a third path surfaced. Trigger my father's silent alarm before Rafe's crossing. Hand the decision to the county. I ease the reading room door open. The corridor ahead is pure black. No moonlight, no garden glow filtering through. I pull my shoes off, go forward in stocking feet, distributing weight toward the outer edge of each step. The 3rd floorboard past the bathroom cracks. The 7th tread on the main staircase groans under any real load. The board just off the newel post will betray anyone who walks its center. 43 years inside the foundry, I know where every weakness lives. 7 minutes to reach the ground floor. Each footfall its own negotiation between speed and silence. My fingers trail the banister, reading the carved acanthus my father had commissioned in 1964. From below, breathing. Shallow, rhythmic. Beckett in the kitchen probably, or Rafe in the basement. Sound moves through this house's heating vents with no logic I've ever mapped. Fiction taught me to pick locks. Whether I walk out alive is a question only reality can settle. I reach the main floor at 11:14 p.m. 15 feet ahead lies the reception area, my father's desk still pressed against the east wall. In 1975, when County Dispatch rebuilt their emergency response infrastructure, they wired silent alarm triggers into the homes of federal prosecutors and judges. Mechanical, pre-digital, a concealed drawer pulled 3 times in sequence fires a coded pulse along dedicated phone lines. If those lines still terminate somewhere. If the hardware hasn't gone dark in the 47 years since my father left his post. If County Dispatch still monitors Carter-era frequencies. I move across the reception area, one deliberate step at a time. The desk surfaces from shadow that enormous oak thing 8 feet across, gouged by decades of case files and coffee rings. I feel along the right side panel until I locate the seam. The hidden drawer opens on a whisper of wood on wood. 3 inches out, back in, out again, in, out. In deep inside the foundry, something mechanical clicks. Or I'm telling myself it does. No beep, no indicator light, just faith in 40-year-old engineering. Then light detonates across my face. A flashlight beam, industrial strength, nailing me against the desk like an insect on a board. My hand flies up, pupils burning. Footsteps close from opposite directions. Heavy boots from the kitchen. Lighter steps climbing from below. Impressive. A voice I don't know, flat Midwest vowels. 64 years old and you still move through a house like smoke. The beam drops slightly. Vision returns in stages. Rafe Callum, 43 years old, carrying himself like someone whose body remembered years of field work before the FBI made him a wanted man. Weathered face temples, going gray eyes running the quiet math of exits and angles. The environmental whistleblower who had made my son a criminal. He held a compact black stun device with the ease of long familiarity. "Dad?" Beckett stepped out of the kitchen doorway. Disappointment in his voice, not surprise. "You got through the reading room lock. Should have accounted for that." "He already sent the signal," Rafe said, nodding toward the desk. "County gets 90 minutes to respond to Foundry's silent alarms. Could be less if the priority codes changed." They'd been waiting. They knew. That understanding moved through me like ice water. They'd tracked every step, let me slip through the dark, let me reach the desk and pull that drawer because the contingency had already been planned. "Then we go earlier," Beckett said, checking his watch. "Get Corbin on the phone. 3:45 a.m., not 3. We can still make Blaine before County rolls." Rafe advanced the stun device level and steady. The flashlight's backwash lit his face from below. Granite certainty, the particular kind that settles in a man convinced of his own righteousness. Men like him don't trade. They don't give ground. "Your father understood leverage better than you do," he said quietly. 32 years as a federal prosecutor, he knew when surrendering a skirmish was the price of the larger campaign. 8 to 10 people a month, Gerald. 8 to 10 families who stay whole instead of being shredded by corporate lawyers and manufactured evidence. You'd torch all of that to block one crossing. "I'd torch it because my home is the infrastructure," I said, steadier than I had any right to sound. "Because it's made my son a criminal. Because it's made me one too." "Criminal in service of what?" Rafe cut in. "Justice. These people were failed by every system meant to protect them. We're the correction." Beckett moved forward, jaw tight. "Dad, response time to Foundry alarms averages 92 minutes. I pulled the historical logs. You hit that drawer at 11:16. They arrive around 12:47 a.m., maybe 100 if dispatch is slow. We're across the border by 400. Rafe pressed the crackling edge of the stun device against my sternum close enough that I caught coffee on his breath. "The cassette stays here," he said, free hand gesturing back toward the reading room. "So do you. County shows up, you tell them the alarm triggered by accident. Old system, old house, you bump the desk moving around in the dark, they write a report and leave. And if I don't play it that way..." Rafe's smile stopped at his mouth. "Then Beckett loses everything. Bar card freedom, any future gone. And those 8 to 10 families a month lose their last lifeline. Your call, Gerald. Your son or your principles." They marched me back upstairs. The reading room door closed. The chain engaged from the hallway side. I heard it settle into place. Locked in again, but the alarm was out there. 92 minutes until County. 4 hours until Rafe crossed at Blaine. And in my pocket, a cassette that could unravel all of it. If law enforcement arrived in time, if 40-year-old wiring still connected to someone listening, if I could bring myself to finish what I'd started. That last part, I still hadn't resolved. 9 minutes later, they brought me back downstairs. Rafe had put away the stun device. He held out my car keys. "Change of plans," he said, turning the Mercedes fob between his fingers. "I recalculated the alarm response time. 15 minutes until county units arrive, not 92. Your father's system feeds into the old emergency grid, pre-digital faster priority codes. The cushion's gone." I stood with my back against the desk trying to absorb this. Beckett was at the kitchen doorway, face giving nothing away. The flashlight had been aimed at the ceiling, throwing pale, indirect light across all three of us. "So you're leaving now?" Not a question. "We're leaving now," Rafe said. "And you're driving. You take me to Blaine and walk away clean. No conspiracy, no obstruction, no charges. Your story is you gave a hitchhiker a ride and dropped him at the border. That's what county hears when they reach an empty house. Sound logic. The tactical adjustment I'd have counseled any client toward when circumstances collapsed faster than planned. Cut losses. Hold what can still be held. Let go of what can't. And Beckett, Rafe's expression didn't shift. Stays. Faces RICO. Money laundering. Harboring fugitives across state lines. Federal charges, federal sentencing guidelines. Minimum 12 years, probably 15 with enhancements unless he cooperates and gives up Corbin and Aldrich, then maybe 8. The figures fell like separate blows. 12 years, 15, 8 if he talked. I watched Beckett's face while Rafe walked through the numbers searching for something to surface. Dad, no. Beckett's voice broke, and it broke precisely. Don't listen to him. Don't leave me here. Rafe's voice stayed almost tender as he pressed on. Every decision that funneled us into this room was yours. Your father can either pull himself free or sink alongside you, but shared blood doesn't obligate him to surrender his liberty on your behalf. What kind of father wouldn't choose himself over a son who turned into the monster? The words hit me like something toxic spreading through the bloodstream. He was presenting exactly 2 doors: become an accomplice or walk away. Ferry him to the border and emerge clean on the other side, or plant my feet next to Beckett and absorb federal conspiracy charges with him. The man who shaped him against the man who outlives him. I heard my own voice, flat and mechanical. How much time? 12 minutes. County units are already in motion. Choose. I turned and looked at Beckett. Not a glance. A long, deliberate examination. His shoulders shook. That final appeal had fractured his voice. His eyes caught the weak light and shimmered. A masterclass in terrified son watching his father weigh him against his own survival. And yet his hands rested on the doorframe without a tremor. I knew those hands. Age 8, his mother's vase in pieces on the floor. The crying was persuasive, the grief apparently real. But his hands had simply hung at his sides, loose and motionless. The cat hadn't done it. Age 14. A story about older boys taking his money. Every muscle in his body broadcast outraged innocence, but not once during the police report did his hands so much as quiver. The cash had gone toward an Xbox he'd tucked away in his closet. Age 19. A disciplinary hearing, a cheating charge, tears welling in his eyes. His hands perfectly calm the whole way through. The accusation held up. His hands don't shake. They never do when the story is a lie. You're really going to abandon me? The word cracked under Beckett's weight as he said it. After I gave you everything. I let my shoulders sag. Let them read a broken father doing his arithmetic. It wasn't hard to perform. 6 hours of genuine anguish had done the groundwork. I was expressing something I truly felt, but running beneath it, cold and precise, was the calculation: what game are they actually playing, and why had Beckett's hands been still as stone the entire time Rafe was already hauling Beckett toward the reading room chair, zip ties in hand? From the hallway, I watched, wearing the face of a man who'd traded loyalty for survival. Rafe forced Beckett into the seat and lashed his wrists to the armrests with the ease of someone who'd done it before. Then he bent close and breathed the words directly into my son's ear. The safe, northeast corner of the cellar. The instant I'm clear. 60 seconds, not one more. Here's what he didn't know. The foundry's cellar was dug in 1923, cut straight into bedrock below the building's southeast quadrant. My father kept the architectural survey framed on his office wall. I had memorized every line of it before I was old enough to drive. The only point of entry the foundation permits is the southeast stairwell. There is no northeast corner. There never was. That whispered instruction was stagecraft, a signal engineered for my ears, built to spike my pulse. Hit the accelerator. Don't reason it through. But the geography was impossible, and impossible geography confirmed what Beckett's unwavering hands had already told me. Every moment of this had been choreographed in advance. You're handing me to the police. Beckett let his voice shatter on the accusation, pitching it loud enough to fill the room. After all of it. Rafe's reply came measured, threaded with just the right ratio of regret to cold logic. You should have left your father out of this. He drives, you wait. End of terms. Beckett wrenched against the bindings, his face flushed with what passed for real panic. I kept watching his hands. Steady, controlled. Those ties would probably slide off in moments. I let my posture crumble another degree. I'll drive, I said, keeping my voice low. Let me grab my coat, the cold's come in. Rafe gave a single nod. 2 minutes. I covered the distance to the hall closet on legs that shook, not because Rafe frightened me, but because of the gamble I was about to make. My winter coat was where I'd left it. I reached into the inner pocket and found the small rectangular shape waiting there. The backup cassette recorder, voice-activated, pocket-sized, picked up last spring when I was deep in research for a surveillance novel. 6-hour battery-fresh tape, seeded 2 days ago, never triggered. I pushed the record button through the fabric, registered the faint mechanical pulse that meant it had engaged, then drew the code on and worked the buttons shut. The device sat snug and warm against my chest. Rafe was at the door. 6 minutes. Move. I hesitated at the threshold or made it read that way. Which crossing, Peace Arch or commercial? A slight narrowing of his eyes. Then the answer came, truck commercial gate 7:34 a.m. Exactly. Canadian Transit Papers under Foster Clark Foster. Every syllable feeding itself onto the tape coiled in my pocket. I kept the pressure on, performing the role of the rattled accomplice. Gate 7 skeleton crew, 2 guards on Corbin's payroll. A refrigerated truck bearing the Vancouver cold storage markings. 90 seconds door to door. Corbin positioned on the north side. $80,000 wired to account 4718. The whole network going dark until spring. Rafe was constructing a complete federal case for me, brick by brick, confident that fear had rendered me harmless. Then Beckett's voice arrived, no heat in it, no theater stripped entirely bare. Rafe, the coat, search his coat. The air in the room changed. Rafe's hand landed on my shoulder, anchoring me at the threshold. His other hand began its arc toward my pocket. 1 second. That was the full inventory of time I had fight back Bolt or let him pull out the cassette that could bury them both. We clear the doorway before his fingers close on anything. He seizes my elbow and walks me hard into the November rain. Since sunset, the temperature had bled away 15 degrees, and what falls now isn't drizzle. It's ice translated into needles, finding every patch of exposed skin. 2 minutes, Rafe says, eyes quartering the dark. We're through the gate before County reaches the access road. He angles us away from the main drive toward the far end of the rear lot. An unplated dark green pickup truck sits idling near the boundary fence, exhaust curling up into the rain. The recorder against my ribs is still warm, still turning, pulling every footfall and every word Rafe utters into its reels. Headlights blink on out in the distance, 2 fast pulses access road roughly a quarter mile back. Rafe locks up. His grip on my arm goes tight. County, he says half to himself. They're ahead of schedule. But I'm not looking at the lights. I'm looking at the second floor window on the east face of the foundry, where a light is pulsing in deliberate sequence. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Morse. I absorbed it in Boy Scouts 56 years ago. That pattern is SOS, except it's been reversed. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long. Not distress. It's opposite. An all clear. Vera's window. 2 years my neighbor. A 68-year-old widow who had been watching this building since long before I understood what it needed watching for. She'd handed me coffee every single morning without once remarking on how often Beckett had taken to coming around. And now her light was tapping out tactical confirmation in bureau shorthand. I let my gaze drift into the shadows past the lot's edge. Something moved 30 yards out near the garden wall. A figure standing with weight forward on the left foot, balanced across the balls of both feet, hands held in close readiness. Warren Halsey, not crouching, not running for the trees, holding position. I had watched that exact posture from the gallery at federal courthouse proceedings more times than I could count. Nothing civilian about it. That was trained instinct, bureau grade, and current. Warren wasn't in flight. He was holding a perimeter. Get in. Rafe pulled me toward the truck. The engine was already turning over, but something in his voice had shifted. The assurance was thinner now, the cadence of a man quietly repricing his odds. The headlights had halved the distance. More sets of lights were materializing behind the first. Not a single county unit. 3, maybe 4. Inside the foundry. Beckett was already free of the zip ties. The moment Rafe's footsteps had receded far enough, the plastic fell away with no effort at all. They'd never been drawn tight, just arranged to look it. He rolled his neck, squared his shoulders, and crossed the reading room with clean, purposeful strides toward the southeast corner. Behind a false panel set into the built-in bookshelf right where my father had put it in 1972 sat the safe. Beckett crouched, nudged 3 volumes out of the way, and brought the combination lock into the light. Combination 61473, he whispered to himself. Northeast corner, right where he said. Except, as I have already told you, no northeast corner. The geography in the whisper was deliberately wrong, a test to see whether Beckett would execute the instruction regardless. He'd cracked the combination weeks before any of this. He'd stood at the door gap and watched patient and unnoticed while I opened the safe for state papers, and he'd waited for a moment of sufficient distraction to complete his study of me. The lock disengaged with a quiet click. What the safe held my father's original dossier dated 1975. The record of a federal prosecutor's methodical investigation into fugitive networks sheltering their people inside ordinary residential buildings. The network that investigation had taken apart. The same network that had apparently reassembled itself 47 years on. Same corridors, same routes, same operational skeleton, all of it blueprinted in my father's own hand. Beckett drew out the dossier, leather cover watermarks from decades of age pages, dense with evidence that had survived Justice Department orders demanding its destruction. A long-game insurance policy. Proof that the network's roots grew into soil no one in authority had ever wanted disturbed. My son was now cradling the precise thing I had laid out for him to take. The window at his back slid open without a sound. Vera Prudhomme came through it, moving nothing like a 62-year-old widow with arthritis. She's 62. Yes, I had checked her references, her background, her entire employment record. Every detail authentic, every detail deliberately constructed. She holds an FBI tracking terminal in her left hand, credentials in her right. The warm domestic softness she'd worn for 14 months was gone. In its place, cold professional authority. Beckett Nathaniel Adler, she says, and her voice carries a federal weight I had never once detected across all those morning coffees. FBI, that dossier has carried an RFID tracker since your father placed it in the safe 6 weeks ago. Beckett's hands went rigid on the leather cover. The practiced composure, the strategic mask he'd worn all evening fractured for the first time. Put it on the desk, Vera continued. Hands where I can see them. Your network has been penetrated for 8 months. Rafe Callum flipped in March. Warren Halsey has been undercover since February. Every crossing point, every wire transfer, every fugitive funneled through the system. The Bureau had documentation covering all of it. The dossier slipped from Beckett's fingers and landed on the desk. His palms came up slowly, but his eyes were still working, scanning the room, pricing exits, hunting for whatever pivot might convert exposure into escape. Corbin and Aldrich were taken into custody 17 minutes ago at the Blaine Crossing, Vera said. Gate 7 has had surveillance on it since October. The 80,000 Rafe referenced that transaction tripped a FinCEN alert the moment it cleared. Account 4718 was a federal honeypot. Outside in the parking lot, a siren broke through the freezing rain. Not distant anymore. Half a mile out, maybe less, and gaining. More layered in behind it, county units pressing up the access road, state police off the highway, federal vehicles rolling from the regional field office. Rafe's hand drifted toward his waistband. I felt the shift in him before I saw it, something hardening, a decision arriving. He was running the numbers. Could he clear his device before Warren closed the gap? Could he flip me from witness to leverage? The cassette recorder kept turning against my chest, threading everything onto tape. Rafe's account of Gate 7, the crossing window, the payment details, his admission that Beckett would shed the restraints and vanish, all of it captured. All of it evidence I no longer needed because the Bureau had been building their own record for 8 months. Gerald, Rafe said quietly, his voice pulled tight with something that wasn't quite panic. Get in the truck. Now. But I was tracking Warren Halsey, moving through the shadows, cinching the perimeter, watching more headlights sweep through the gate, counting the tactical positions, assembling around the foundry, federal units boxing us from 3 sides. My son was inside with an FBI agent. I was outside with a man whose hand was resting on a device, and every second of evidence I had risked everything to gather was redundant. The Bureau had been 10 steps ahead of all of us. Rafe's arm locked across my throat before the first tactical boot touched asphalt. The device pressed cold against my temple, his forearm biting into my airway. His pulse beat hard through the layers of clothing between us, elevated but metered. This wasn't fear. This was arithmetic. Rafe Callum, FBI. Warren's voice came through the rain, amplified and unambiguous. Release him. Device down. 3 seconds. Red laser points converged on Rafe's torso from 3 separate positions, rooftop, garden wall, the southeast corner near the delivery entrance. I walk or the old man doesn't, Rafe said, his voice holding steady. Hostage situations require negotiation. Get me a vehicle and clear passage. I remembered the entry from page 47 of my father's dossier. Rafe Callum, Bosnia, 1997. Close quarters extraction. Right hand dominant device in the right hand left arm for restraint. Weight shifts forward before the trigger is pulled. Vulnerable to lateral disruption initiated by the hostage on the left side. I drove hard left, dropped my center of gravity, and torqued against the softest point in his hold. 8 inches of movement, maybe. His forearm eased for half a second. Warren covered the distance in 3 strides. The tackle put Rafe into the wet asphalt with the full weight of federal training behind it. The device skidded across the pavement. 2 agents stepped from the shadows and had Rafe's wrists cuffed before he could pull himself together. I lurched forward, gasping, my throat on fire. Warren steadied me with one hand. "You called it exactly," he said low and measured. "Lateral left, just like you described." Just as I had laid it out 3 days earlier, phoning from a gas station 20 miles away on a burner, bought for that single call when I'd told him I needed help, but couldn't hand him the full picture yet when I'd asked him to extend trust without giving him a reason to. Through the reading room window, I watched federal agents close around Beckett. Vera held his arms while a second agent brought out cuffs. My son stood without resistance beside the stolen dossier, his face cut white by tactical flashlights. Our eyes found each other through the rain-streaked glass. I braced for anger, for pleading. His expression returned nothing, the same hollow, sealed calm he'd carried at 19 when the ethics board announced its verdict at 23 when his mentor surfaced the forged letter. He didn't look away. Neither did I. Then the agent steered him toward the door, and he was gone. By 12:30 a.m., the building was empty save for a single perimeter unit. Warren found me on the back concrete steps, the same steps where Beckett and I used to spend summer evenings before law school, before every conversation became a negotiation. He sat down beside me without asking, unscrewed a thermos, and poured coffee into the lid. "Black, no sugar," he said. "Same as it's always been." The first swallow tasted like 45 years of friendship, like two young men who still believed justice was something you could actually hold. I reached into my coat and set the cassette recorder in Warren's palm. "Everything," I said. "Gate 7, the crossing window, the account numbers. Corbin's payment, all of it." He sealed it into an evidence bag. "We have 8 months of wire recordings," he said. "But this is your son's voice, your evidence. That carries weight with the jury." "He's my son," I said, and I handed him over to federal custody. "You did," Warren said, "because he would have kept lying until people got hurt." We sat without speaking while steam rose from our cups and dissolved into the November cold. When Warren asked whether I'd attend the trial, the question had no answer I could reach. He didn't press. He filled my cup with what remained in the thermos and waited the way he had waited across 45 years, trusting me to find my own way to the last line. My son's voice fills the federal courtroom from a recorder he once called obsolete. The sound is thin, filtered through speakers built for digital sources, but every word arrives with perfect clarity. I sit in the gallery 3 rows behind the prosecution table and listen to Beckett disassemble his own future. Corbin handled logistics, transportation, documentation, the crossing schedules. Aldrich ran the financial layer, payments, transfers, keeping the money clean. The federal prosecutor, a woman in her mid-40s named Ingrid Farrow, stands beside the evidence table where my father's cassette recorder rests in a clear plastic bag labeled Exhibit 14A. She lets 43 seconds of tape unspool before cutting it. "Analog cassette recording November 16, 2022, she announces to the preliminary hearing. Subject Beckett Adler detailing an $800,000 payment structure across 13 months of operation. The recording continues for an additional 6 minutes, providing complete architectural documentation of a $3.2 million money laundering network. The defense attorney, court-appointed since Beckett's own firm, is under federal seizure objects on technical grounds, chain of custody authentication, procedural theater. Everyone present understands the tape is genuine. This single recording," Ingrid Farrow continues, "establishes sufficient evidentiary foundation for RICO conspiracy, money laundering, and obstruction charges against 5 defendants, Beckett Adler, Rafe, Callum, Corbin, Vreeland, Aldrich, Oster, and network facilitator Owen Bassett. Combined with 8 months of wire surveillance and financial documentation, we have grounds for maximum sentencing recommendations. Maximum sentencing, 18 to 24 years. The number settled into my chest like ballast. Obsolete. That was the word he'd used. I can locate the precise moment. 3 years ago, working through my father's study, I'd pulled the recorder from a desk drawer. Beckett had lifted it, turned it in his hands, and arranged his face into that particular expression, the one that meant a pointed observation was on its way. "Dad, you're aware they make digital versions now. This belongs in a museum." I kept it regardless, used it for dictating novel passages when I wanted the feel of something physical. And on November 16th, when I needed to capture evidence, my son would never think to hunt for that obsolete machine, became the most consequential piece of technology in my possession. The hearing runs another 90 minutes, financial exhibits, wire transcripts, Warren's testimony about the 8-month investigation. I sit through all of it with the same detached precision I once brought to the courtroom as a practicing attorney. Observe, process, don't feel. Feeling is a task for later. I drive home through early December rain, the variety of persistent northwest drizzle that drains the world of color and depth. The Foundry looks different now. Not like home, more like a crime scene that's been signed back over to its owner. The federal evidence teams left everything technically where they found it, but the house carries a different quality. Violated, examined, known. I brew coffee. I don't drink and settle into the living room as the evening collapses into night. The television runs in the background, anchors cycling through national stories I can't make myself follow. Then the local segment breaks for news. Defense attorneys Corbin Vreeland and Aldrich Oster were taken into custody this morning in a coordinated federal operation targeting what prosecutors are calling a sophisticated fugitive transit network. The footage shows tactical agents outside a luxury condominium in Portland's South Park blocks. Corbin Vreeland, 47, silver-haired, in an expensive suit, being walked out in cuffs. Aldrich Oster, 52, emerges minutes later from a separate building, his face arranged into careful blankness. I'd never met either of them. They existed in my mind only as names Beckett spoke on that tape, pieces of a conspiracy I'd helped dismantle. Now they are actual human beings being destroyed by evidence I supplied. Federal agents seized computers, financial records, and over $2.8 million from corrupted trust accounts. The anchor continues. The law firm of Vreeland Oster and Associates is under federal receivership with 43 active client cases now under review for potential malpractice and fraud. 43 clients. 43 people whose legal representation just dissolved because their attorneys were operating a criminal network alongside their legitimate practice. How many of those cases were actually clean? How many clients were complicit? How many were blameless people whose lives are now entangled through mere association? When did justice begin to feel like punishment for the witness? I won. The network is gone. Beckett, Rafe, Corbin Aldrich, and this Owen Bassett I had never heard of before, all of them staring down maximum federal sentences. The evidence I gathered, the tape I recorded, the alarm I triggered, everything worked precisely as it was supposed to. So why does winning feel like a cell I'm inside? The news pivots to weather. I should cut the set off, go upstairs, try to sleep. Instead, I sit in the dark and watch rain drag itself down the glass, feeling the hollowness that has moved in where everything else used to be. My phone buzzes on the coffee table. Restricted number, federal area code. Gerald. Warren's voice worn thin but professionally steady. Got a minute? Yeah. Beckett wants to see you, pre-sentencing. He specifically requested you through his attorney this afternoon. I watched the streetlight dissolve in the rain beyond the window. Did he say why? Silence on the line. Then, he said he needs to tell you something before the judge makes it permanent. His exact words, before my father has to live with what comes next. Before I have to live with what comes next, as though I'm not already living with it, as though the weight of having helped demolish my son's life isn't something I carry with me every waking hour. When, tomorrow 2 p.m. federal detention facility downtown, I can arrange clearance, but you don't have to go. You've given enough, Gerald. You don't owe him closure. I don't owe him closure. Warren is right, legally, morally, every practical way you can measure it. I've done what duty required. I handed over evidence. I cooperated fully with federal investigators. I sat through the preliminary hearing and watched my testimony begin the process of taking 2 decades from my son's life. I don't owe Beckett anything, but he's still my son. Arrange it, I say. 2 p.m. tomorrow. Warren exhales slowly. I'll send you the details. Gerald, brace yourself for whatever he's going to say. He has nothing left to protect. The call ends. I sit in the dark holding a phone that feels heavier than it should, wondering what truth could possibly be worse than what I already know. The woman my son extorted is crying in a federal hallway and she is apologizing to me. Rosario Fuentes stands outside deposition room 4C, her testimony finished. She is 47, slight, carrying the kind of quiet dignity that survives being weaponized inside someone else's scheme. I recognized her from Warren's witness list, the woman who encountered Beckett on November 3rd, the one he threatened into silence. She spots me before I can step back. Her face falls apart. Mr. Adler? My name breaks in her mouth. I'm so sorry, I should have told you. I ought to keep moving. I'm here to review exhibits ahead of tomorrow's pre-sentencing meeting, not to offer absolution to the people my son terrorized. But she is standing there crying, and I am the father of the man who taught her to live in fear. Mrs. Fuentes, I say quietly, you have nothing to apologize for. I do. She presses a shredded tissue to her eyes. He told me that if I said anything, immigration would look into my family. My daughter's husband, his visa renewal was still pending. Beckett said one call and Mateo would be deported before Christmas. Of course she believed him. Beckett was a defense attorney, authority access, the professional polish that makes a threat sound like a law of physics. You protected your daughter, I say. That's what parents do. She looks at me with reddened eyes. But you're his father. You turned him in. You chose differently. Two parents. Two impossible choices. Only one of us made the right one. I chose too late, I say. You chose in time to protect someone. That's the difference. She nods, still crying, and moves away down the marble corridor. I watch her go and find myself thinking about how many others are out there. People Beckett leveraged, pressured, used. People whose testimony is now assembling the case that will absorb 20 years of his life. 3 weeks later, I meet Vera at a small cafe in Hillsborough, 15 miles from the foundry, far enough from federal buildings. She arrives exactly on time. Jeans wool sweater, reading glasses on a chain. She looks precisely like the neighbor I believed she was for 2 years, except something has changed in her eyes. Sharper now, assessing. Vera Prudhomme isn't your real name, I say when she takes her seat. It is now, she says. She orders black coffee, then turns back to me. 32 years Directorate of Operations, retired 2016. When Rafe Callum's name crossed federal watch lists, I volunteered as counterintelligence observer. The paper you dropped in October, I say. The strange phone number. Secure FBI field line. I left it somewhere you'd find it. Waited to see if you'd call. When you didn't, I decided you were either oblivious or running your own operation. Then I watched you checking sight lines from the reading room window. She had used my fiction as fieldcraft, my imagination repurposed as her tradecraft. The Morse signal from the mezzanine window, I say. That came from my 4th novel, Chapter 18. Vera confirms it inverted SOS for tactical confirmation. I figured if you wrote it, you'd know it when you saw it. You read my books to run an operation. I read them because they're good, she says. Your tradecraft is sharper than half the field manuals at Langley. The compliment sits wrong. My invented methods help to bring down my own son. Then Vera sets her cup down with deliberate care. Beckett requested a pre-sentencing meeting. Did Warren tell you what he said to the magistrate? I shake my head. He wants to confess something that wasn't on the tape, something only you would understand. The warmth leaves her voice entirely. Be ready, Gerald. People with nothing left to lose don't request meetings to apologize. I stare out at the December rain, turning the parking lot colorless. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., I'll sit across from my son and hear whatever truth he has been saving for last. Vera is right. It's going to hurt. The phone receiver weighs more than any manuscript I've ever held. Through reinforced glass at the Federal Detention Center in Sheridan, my son sits in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs his face thinner than it was 5 weeks ago. He picks up his receiver. Our eyes meet. Dad. His voice comes through small and far away, filtered through institutional phone systems engineered to remind everyone that closeness is a privilege the incarcerated have surrendered. Thanks for coming. I nod. Words feel beside the point. What do you say to the son you helped put away? Beckett's hands are steady on the phone. No trembling, no performance. Just exhaustion, and something underneath that might be honesty. Vera said you wanted to tell me something, I say. Something not on the tape. He drops his gaze to the metal divider between us. An apology and an explanation. You deserve both. I deserve nothing, I say. You're the one in a federal jumpsuit because I was an idiot. His voice fractures, and this time it is real. Dad, I thought you built everything on dirt. Grandfather's ties to organized crime. The early book deals that came too easily. The way you never talked about how things really started. I thought... He stops, swallows. I thought our whole family legacy was corrupt, that everything I inherited was tainted. The words arrive like something physical. What I wanted success I'd actually earned. Beckett continues, his voice picking up momentum now like a confession that has been damned too long. Not success built on money laundering or mob favors or whatever arrangements you'd made to get the foundry off the ground. I started the network because I wanted to prove I could build something real, something that counted on its own terms. Outside your shadow, outside grandfather's shadow. He thought I was dirty. All this time, he thought I was dirty. Your grandfather. I say taking care with every word, testified against the mob. He appeared before a federal grand jury in the 1970s. He was the federal prosecutor who assembled a case that sent 17 organized crime figures to prison. It destroyed his health, the stress, the threats, the months in protective custody. He died of a heart attack in, I stopped myself before the year escapes. He died because testifying took everything out of him. Beckett's face goes slack, but the connections, the files in the safe, the sealed records, were evidence he preserved. I cut in, insurance in case the mob ever came for us. Documentation ensuring that if anything happened to our family, federal prosecutors would know exactly who gave the order. And my early book deals, I laugh, but there's nothing warm in it. I wrote 17 novels in 12 years to keep us solvent after your mother left. 17 books while working as a public defender because your grandfather's pension barely covered the mortgage. There was no Dirt Beckett. There was only survival. He stares at me through the glass. For the first time, his hands begin to shake. Then I threw my life away over a lie, he whispers. You threw it away over pride, I say. The lie just gave you cover. You wanted to believe I was corrupt because it made your own corruption feel justified. You needed to believe you were above me, so you built a criminal network to demonstrate it. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice. The silence between us runs for 30 seconds, a full minute. Beckett's eyes fill, but he doesn't move to wipe them. He simply lets the tears fall. I'm sorry, he says at last. For everything. For using the foundry, for the lying, for... His voice collapses completely. For making you choose between your son and your integrity. I'm sorry you convinced yourself you were escaping corruption that was never there. I say, but I'm not sorry for the choice I made. You committed federal crimes. You terrorized witnesses. You constructed a pipeline for fugitives. Whatever story you told yourself about our family, those actions belong to you. The guard signals 5 minutes remaining. Beckett nods, absorbing it. Will you come again? He asks. Before sentencing, I sit with the question, weigh what I owe him against what I owe myself. Consider what forgiveness even means when the person seeking it is still culpable, whatever his misreading of the facts. I don't know, I tell him honestly. I'll think about it. He nods and takes that for what it is. The call ends. I drive back to the foundry through late December rain, the sky the shade of old concrete. The bookstore has been shuttered since the arrests, the yellow crime scene tape long gone, but the building still weighted with everything that occurred inside it. I unlock the front door for the first time in 5 weeks. The smell reaches me before anything else. Old paper, wood, polish, the specific mustiness of a building that hasn't been breathing. Dust motes drift through the afternoon light slanting in from the front windows. Everything sits exactly as I left it, yet fundamentally altered. This is no longer sanctuary. It's a crime scene I'm being handed back. I move past shelves of legal thrillers and mysteries, past the biography section where my father's favorite books still face outward. One volume is out of place, The Ghost Protocol, my 4th novel sitting in the wrong section. I pull it and return it to its proper position. How do you reopen a bookstore where your son was arrested? The answer surfaces quietly. You reopen it because it isn't about what happened here. It's about what still needs answering. I climb to the reading room. The safe sits behind its false panel, exactly where Beckett found it. I enter the combination and feel the lock give. Inside my father's envelope, yellowed paper, the seal unbroken since he placed it here 43 years ago. On the front in his handwriting, for Gerald to be opened after I'm gone, when you're ready to understand. I kept this place closed to preserve a ghost. Time to open it for the living truth. I carry the envelope downstairs past empty shelves and quiet corners to the front window where December light filters through rain-streaked glass. The foundry isn't about what was. It's about what still needs answering. 43 years. Dad's letter has waited 43 years. No more. Oh. I hold the envelope up to the light. The paper is thin, fragile answers sealed inside about why my father stayed, why he testified against the mob, knowing it would cost him everything, what he needed me to know after he was gone. I slide my thumb beneath the flap. The seal surrenders with a faint whisper of old glue. Inside 3 handwritten pages on legal pad paper, my father's precise script covering both sides. 43 years of silence about to end. I unfold the first page and begin to read. My father's handwriting hasn't aged a day. I've aged 43 years without it. The letter opens in my hands on New Year's Eve candlelight, throwing shadows across 3 pages of careful script. Outside the reading room windows, the city readies itself for midnight. Inside, I'm alone with words set down before my son was born. Gerald, the letter begins. Just my name in his hand. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And you finally opened the safe I built into this building. The combination is your birth year. Not because I'm sentimental, but because you are my true heritage. Not this building, not the books, not the reputation I've spent decades assembling. The bookstore was my way of stepping back from what I'd done. The testimony, the lives I upended to shield others, the organized crime figures I sent to prison knowing their families would eventually come for mine. I built the foundry as sanctuary, but the safe Gerald the safe and the silent alarm I had installed in '76, those were never about protecting money or locking away evidence. They were your escape hatch. If history looped back, if the wrongs I committed ever returned, if you ever needed a way clear and I was no longer there to provide it, I set the combination to your birth year. I wired the alarm with county dispatch codes routing to federal response. I sealed everything I knew into files and locked it here. Not for me. For you. You are my escape son. My passage out of the dark I walked through. Every novel you write, every honest thing you put into the world, that is the legacy I wanted. Not the prosecutions, not the testimony. Use what's in the safe if you need it, or don't. But know it was assembled from love I could never say aloud and protection I could never guarantee. You are my true heritage, Dad. I fold the letter with hands that tremble for the first time in weeks. He knew. Decades before I needed any of it, he knew. The candle burns low. Midnight closes in. I sit in the dark and come to understand that my father built me an exit from a danger I hadn't yet encountered, and I used it precisely as he had planned 43 years on to find my way clear of a son who had turned our heritage into a crime scene. Fathers and sons, escape and return, legacy and betrayal. But the letter shifts something. My father didn't leave me a building. He left me a way out. New Year's morning arrives carrying winter sunlight and coffee. I unlock the foundry's main doors at 9 a.m. to find Warren on the front step with 2 cups in hand and Vera behind him bearing something wrapped in checkered cloth. Couldn't let you spend the first day of the year alone, Warren says. Vera unwraps homemade peach cobbler steam lifting from the crust. Made it properly this time, she says, a small smile at the edge of her mouth. No shortcuts. We pull wooden chairs into the main aisle. Morning light pours through the windows. The cobbler is perfect, the balance of tart and sweet exactly right. The coffee is strong. The company is quiet. Beckett's sentencing is February 9th, Warren says after his second helping. Federal Judge Mary Ann Castellano, fair but firm. She'll honor whatever the plea agreement yields. I nod. The information doesn't land the way it would have a month ago. It's just fact now. My son will be sentenced. I'll attend or I won't. The machinery of justice turns regardless. To the foundry, Warren says, raising his cup. Not the building, the man. Vera lifts hers. To survival. I raise mine, feeling warmth move through the ceramic into my palms. To escapes the ones we build and the ones we earn. We drink. The coffee tastes like normalcy. After they leave, I climb back up to the reading room. The vintage manual typewriter sits on the desk. A 1957 Hermes 3000 I'd picked up at an estate sale 30 years ago and never once used. Fresh white paper, loaded keys waiting. I spent 20 years writing this story. Now I have to live it. I sit, lay my fingers across the home keys. The metal is cool and familiar. No delete key, no backspace. Only forward motion and the permanence of what's struck. I type. My name is Gerald, and I am 64 years old. For 20 years, I wrote novels about fathers and sons who failed each other. Legal thrillers where a protagonist discovered his child had crossed the law. Mysteries where family loyalty went to war with legal duty. Stories where impossible choices left everyone broken. I never imagined I would become one of my own characters. But here I am, typewriter ready, keys cool beneath my hands, about to write the hardest truth I have ever faced. I turned in my son to federal authorities. He turned my home into a front for his criminal operation. When I uncovered it, I captured his confession on a cassette recorder and tripped the silent alarm my father had wired in 43 years ago. This is not a thriller. This is not a mystery. This is what unfolded when fiction crossed into reality. The keys strike forward one by one. Every blow presses something permanent into the page. Through the reading room window, I can make out the foundry's reopened sign catching the morning light. The corner safe sits open and bare, nothing inside now but my father's letter and the cassette that caught it all. Every family has a locked safe. Some hold money, some hold sins. Ours held the truth about getting out. I keep typing. My father taught me that heritage isn't bound up in buildings or reputations. It's in the exits we carve out for the people we love, the escape hatches we put in place decades before anyone thinks to need them, the silent alarms that summon help when the darkness rolls in. I used my father's escape to halt my son's crimes, and now I'm setting it all down in writing because that's what novelists do. We take the hardest truths and make them permanent. Every family has a locked safe. The question isn't what's inside, it's whether you can bring yourself to look. I looked, and here's what I found. The typewriter keys strike steadily on. Outside January 1st opens across cold winter sunlight. That is where the story leaves me. Sitting at the typewriter, January light coming through the window, the foundry quiet at last. I have turned this over in my mind more times than I can count. What it cost was not small. I lost the version of my son I thought I knew. I lost the clean story I had told myself about my father. What I gained was harder to name, something closer to clarity than comfort. I believe God does not hand us the truth all at once. He lets it arrive in pieces at the hour we are finally able to hold it. The silence after Beckett's arrest was the loudest thing I have ever heard, and in that silence I finally understood what my father had built, not a legacy of shame, but a door-marked exit left open for me. If these grandpa revenge stories have taught me anything worth passing on, it is this. First, the secrets a family buries do not disappear. They wait. Know what is in your own safe before someone else opens it for you. Second, loyalty and complicity are not the same thing. One comes from love, the other comes from fear. Learn the difference before it is decided for you. Third, the father stories worth telling are rarely the ones where everything went right. They are the ones where a man did the hard thing anyway, quietly ahead of time for someone who would not understand it until much later. Fourth, if you discover the floor beneath you is not what you believed, stand up anyway. The truth is always a steadier foundation than a comfortable lie. If this story moved you or made you think, leave a comment below. I read every word you leave there. And if you know someone carrying a family secret they have never spoken aloud, share this with them. It might be the thing they needed to hear. Subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge so you never miss one of these. Thank you for sitting with me today. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.